Thank y'all so much for being here today. We're very excited to have y'all. Yes, thank you. Okay, so our moderator for this panel today is Mira Debs. Mira Debs is the executive director of Yale's Education Studies program, a lecturer in sociology, and a voracious reader of all kinds of genre fiction. Her research and teaching interests include urban education policy, school choice and school integration, families and schools, progressive schooling, and comparative international education. She is the author of Diverse Families, Desirable Schools, Public Montessori in the Era of Choice by Harvard Education Press, and the co-editor of the Handbook of Montessori Education by Bloomsbury in 2023. Kecia Ali is a professor of religion at Boston University. In addition to her book, Human Death, Morality, and Mortality in J.D. Robb's Novels from Baylor 2017, she is the author of various articles about ethics, race, and the good life. She has also published several books about Islam, most focused on gender, marriage, law, and textual interpretation. Her current projects include an introductory book on women in Muslim traditions. You can read more about her at KeciaAli.com. All right, Alyssa Cole is joining us on Zoom today. Thank you so much for being here. Alyssa Cole is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of romance, thrillers, and graphic novels. She currently lives in France with her husband and their menagerie of animals. All right, Adriana Herrera. Adriana Herrera is the USA Today best-selling author. Adriana was born and raised in the Caribbean, but for the last 15 years has let her job and her spouse take her all over the world. She loves writing stories about people who look and sound like her people, getting unapologetically happy endings. When she's not dreaming up love stories, planning logistically complex vacations with her family, or hunting discount Broadway tickets, she's a trauma therapist in New York City. All right, Nicole M. Jackson has a PhD in African American and African diaspora history. Her work focuses on 20th century social movements in the US and UK and representation of people of African descent in popular culture. She also writes erotica and romance under the pen name Katrina Jackson. Kimuli Kasara is an associate professor of political science at Columbia University. In the African context, she focuses on ethnic demography, political violence, and distributive politics. She has published in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. All right, thank you all so much for being here. We're looking forward to getting started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited about this conversation that we're going to have today, and I've made it clear to the panelists that I am an academic who is a fan. So we have a combination of folks on this panel of writers, academics who write about genre fiction, academics who are fans, and academics who are also writers. So looking forward to this combination. As we get started, I wanted to read a piece that was inspiring to me from Dr. Kecia Ali's book. This is called Human in Death, and it makes a case about the learning that happens in genre fiction. So I thought this was a really nice way to kick off our panel. So she writes, like all literature, genre fiction explores the human condition. Crime novels wrestle with justice, law, and retribution. Speculative fiction prompts assessment of current social arrangements, class, race, technology, by showing strikingly changed ones. Notwithstanding the critical scorn and condescension heaped on them, popular romances interrogate social norms around masculinity, femininity, and relationships. Yet even loyal readers of detective stories, romances, or science fictions may be reluctant to take such books too seriously. Perhaps they fear that analyzing pleasure reading will sap their enjoyment, or that their favorite authors will wilt under scrutiny. But critical reflection need not oppose appreciation. It can enhance enjoyment. Through reading strategies, though reading strategies may differ for escapist books and classic literature, all sorts of novels teach readers what matters. And they present situations and characters that do not really exist for readers to reflect on, sympathize with, detest, or admire. I love that as a beginning for thinking about this question. And I'm sure in a number of your contents, you've gotten asked this question of what can we learn from romance? So I'd like to pose that to all of the panelists in thinking about how you make that kind of explanation. Kecia, do you want to start us off?
Wow. Okay. I think books are really important, but authors and readers are really important too. Books are a kind of facilitator of a conversation. Authors, especially if you look at what one author has written over a long time, have preoccupations, have concerns, have ideas about what constitutes the good life. And those ideas change for people who've had long careers over time. And then readers meet the books where they are and bring their own concerns, their own worries. And I think just the process of being an attentive and reflective reader, thinking about when is the author saying something you wholeheartedly agree with? When is the author causing you to think, I don't know, do I buy that? That is really valuable. And that's part of the teaching process. More than any, like, here's a textbook telling you what you need to know about the War of 1812. There's something else going on in these novels.
And panelists, I invite you to jump in at any point, so we can kind of round robin in terms of who wants to reply next.
I mean, I was talking about this yesterday at our workshop. Yeah. I think of romance, like romance to me is an archive of like language and where we are around consent, who gets to have a happy ending, sexuality, desire. Like even for me as an author, but even in the last 5 years that I've been published, I reflect a lot more about how I talk about relationships. Consent is like ever changing, and how it can, like, affirmative consent was like the thing that you were supposed to do 8 years ago, and now we know that just saying yes doesn't mean that there is a yes. So like, just if you want to know how sexuality, desire, consent was in the ether at any given moment, like read a romance. And even for like reading queer romance, for example, even from the beginning, I was talking about this yesterday, like gay for you was what we said was like, someone that like falls for someone that has never been in a queer relationship. That was the language that we used 10, 12 years ago. But now we know that it's like by awakening and late in life is a thing that happens and it's real. So to me, that's just like part of the learning that we can get from romance. But beyond that, when you have people from different backgrounds, like I write about Black, Latin people, and having conversations in my books about colonialism and what that looked like writing historical romance when I can talk about colonies and not actually just have the word colony and actually give context to that, is a learning that happens for people that have been reading historical perhaps for a long time. So
no, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I, like Mira, I'm not a practitioner in any way. I study very dry topics. Ethnic politics in Africa, which is very, very far away. It's not romantic at all. But I've recently started to do more work on gender. But Mira and I know each other through romance novels in a weird way. And I'm just going to connect to your point, but we both went to, we met when we were 12. We went to this middle school in the foothills of the Himalayas in India. And at that time, too long ago, I'm not going to say the number of years, we would get books from the local bazaar, and there wasn't like the kind of rich young adult fiction that exists today. So we read a lot of romance novels that maybe like, who knows about the Mills and Boone? Yeah, okay. So we read a lot of those. We read a lot of like doctor nurse romances, which I don't think you could write today. And then we read, and so we also, there's also I think that the kidnapped by the Sheikh genre. Yeah, okay. And so, this point about like how you learn about so two things. One, I wasn't reading about, my family's from Africa. I wasn't reading anything about anybody like me in these books, these English nurses who were falling for doctors, or being kidnapped by sheikhs. So, and in a weird way, I wonder if, reading about somebody more closer to me would have given me permission to keep reading these books. Yeah, so it is really, really fascinating to see how norms and how have shifted over time. But again, as an enthusiastic consumer, not as an expert. Sorry. Anyway, so and Mira and I were thinking about how it's unimaginable, as 12-year-olds, we were hiding reading these books. So we went to a very religious school, and it was taboo, a Christian school, and to think that we'd be sitting here at Yale University discussing romance novels, it's so wild. Anyway, I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm hoping to learn from the rest of you.
I'm a historian, so I'm particularly interested in historical knowledge, right? But also historical ethics. So I teach romance novels, and I'm really selective about the books that I put in front of my students because I want to give them a way to rethink the history that they are reading about, right? So they're reading primary sources alongside all kinds of novels, including romance novels, because I want them to think about the way we construct historical narratives, the way we use history, and also, for me especially, the debt we owe to those who create the sources that we're reading, right? So they have to, they may tell you they don't learn it, but I've read their final exams and they have not, so. But they have to learn how to struggle with a variety of historical narratives to get at the point of view of, for me, Black people. So for me, I am always thinking about how the historical, in particular the historical romance novels that I use in my classes, position them to do so effectively.
And Alyssa, you have permission to jump in, or wait till the next question?
I was just listening to everyone's answers and also trying to remember the question because I forget the question every time I have to answer. But I guess relating to the excerpt that you read, that is kind of actually why I started writing historical romance, because when I was thinking, I've always loved romance, I've always wanted to be a writer, I've always written stories that had romantic elements, since I was a kid. But when I was thinking about historical romance, I actually thought I would never write historical romance. And the reason that I wrote it is I actually was just pissed off, because it was we have, all this amazing Black American history, or history of Black people around the world and of people of color around the world. And that's not reflected in romance novels. But also, if you read a text, there are obviously hundreds of textbooks about it. There are historians who are writing about these things who, provide the research that I was reading in order to know about this. So I feel like genre novels and genre romance can really be a way of, for me, sharing interesting things that I have read, things that excite me about history or, current events, depending on what time period I'm in. And kind of, I wouldn't say diluting it, but kind of putting it in a form that's easier for people to take in, and that I feel sticks with people longer. Most of us, I feel like most people learn things through movies, TV shows. Sometimes and usually that information is incorrect. That's why we have so many cliches, stereotypes, and, terrible things that people are true, because it was just it over and over again. In addition to the love story, and in addition to representation and stuff like that, we also have the opportunity to put things in there that people didn't know that might interest them, that either they want to research it later, or they're just oh, well, I didn't know this, now I know this, and it can maybe serve some purpose to them, or just in general share history that isn't only known, or share information that isn't known, or share social realities that people don't share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as a follow-up, I'd love to have the authors talk about particular historical periods that they've gotten really excited about in terms of, and some of the excavating work that you're doing of bringing out stories that haven't been told before. And then for those of us who are not yet writing romance novels, maybe to comment on some of the historical learning that you've done through reading romance.
Well, I've only written one historical series so far, and the series is set at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, which was the centennial of the French Revolution. And I stumbled upon an article from a Dominican newspaper saying that the Dominican Republic's first time attending a World's Fair was the 1889, and that our pavilion, when King Leopold was touring the pavilions, he snubbed ours because our president hadn't paid back a debt that he had. And also, like, King Leopold, like, people in glass houses, but whatever. But I didn't know that we had been attending, like, the Dominican Republic had been at World's Fair since that time. And then when I did more research, I found that there were 13 Latin American countries there that were there for the first time, not as colonies, but as independent nations, and that there were more than 8,000 people from Latin America just as exhibitors, plus like the 32 million that came from all over the world to Paris that year. So thinking about that moment, that summer, there were 32 million people from all over the world in Paris. The Eiffel Tower is being inaugurated. And for sure, I know Dominican people are there. And so I was like, I need to write like a whole series of books set in this. And for me, it's like, as the other panelists were saying, like the idea of seeing my people moving in the world like that is something that I haven't gotten to read about in a lot of fiction, much less in like the genre that I love and that I write in, which is romance. Like, I just have not envisioned us. And I mean, knowing that we were there and knowing that in the 18th, 19th century, there were so many people from the Caribbean studying in France. Like, that's something that we know. But I hadn't done the work of just envisioning my people just having like a great time in Paris in 1889. And then as I did research and found more about like the lesbian community and how vibrant it was, I was like, of course, lesbians are having a great time too. Why not Dominican ones? So it's like that period is one that I'm very interested in. I'm also like right now very interested in like the late 1950s in the Dominican Republic, right at the end of the Trujillo dictatorship. I'm very interested in that time right now.
I can answer sort of both parts of that question. So as an instructor, I mean, I've used both Beverly Jenkins and Alyssa Cole in my classrooms for a myriad of reasons, mostly being that I love their books. But in particular, I use Indigo. I teach in Ohio. I live right by the Michigan border. Most of my students come from Ohio and Michigan. And so I use Indigo because what I've noticed over the years is that my students actually don't know very much about Black history in the states where they come from. Mm-hmm. And they want to know about that history. And so Indigo is a way for them to think about these places that they know, literally, these towns that many of them know, and it sort of spurs a particular kind of interest in them. It also, I have a particular student who's from Detroit, and when I told her that Miss Bev was also from Detroit, she was like, well, she's now my new favorite author. And so I think she went and stalked her at a book signing after that. I mean, very lovingly. I'm not from Ohio and Michigan. And so reading Indigo was the catalyst for me to learn more about local history, so that I could then teach my students about local history. Mm-hmm. Similarly, I've used Alyssa's Be Not Afraid in my African American survey, which is, first of all, beautiful, but is a really great way of distilling the ways in which Black people approach the American Revolution, which we so often do not discuss when we're talking about in a general American history course. We do not discuss that Black people, one, have complicated feelings about the revolution, but also that their ultimate goal is freedom. And I think she does that so well in that novella. And so my students read it. I, however, am a 20th century historian, and no one wants to hear this, but the 20th century is a historical time period.
Makes us feel old.
We'll deal. As a Black historian who studies social movements, it is absolutely sort of heartbreaking that there are not more historical set for me during the civil rights and Black power movements. Although I do want to shout out Alyssa's, is it the one with light in the title? I'm like looking at her like, can you please tell me the title?
Let it shine.
Yes, thank you. Okay, not light, but that one is.
Wait, what was the title?
Let It Shine.
Let It Shine. Okay.
That one is also beautiful. I just think Alyssa's writing is beautiful. But there are so few post-World War II historical romances, and it is such a shame, especially if we're thinking about, again, Black history, because there is so much to pull from in that time period. So, hopefully.
Sounds like you're plugging there's a gap there that needs to be filled.
For sure. I mean, I've written a novella set in the 1960s that's all about music, but more people should do that. I mean, more people should just do, especially if we're thinking about representation of people of color. It's set right in the middle of the Civil Rights, Black Power movement, set right in the middle of decolonization. It's set right in the middle of apartheid, right? Like the movement, again, of Black people is massive. And when we're asking for more depictions of people of color in historical romances to continue to avoid these time periods where they exist and they're moving and there is a wealth of scholarly knowledge about it, is actually just an oversight, because I'm being nice.
Sorry, this is actually kind of blowing my mind a little, because, I'm a big fan of Georgette Hare and Regency romance, so I know a lot about the Napoleonic Wars that I shouldn't know. But I was thinking, I was trying to think through, and I just Googled, in fact, like whether they're African romance novels. Like there's no, like, I can't think of, I mean, there are definitely like novels by African women that are, that have romance in them, but I can't think of a series or like, this is another one of the gaps but it had never occurred to me that this is like a gap. So, which is an embarrassing admission. But
Well, there is Love Africa Press, which is
really?
romances written by African authors. Yeah.
Really? I didn't know about that. Okay.
I actually used to do a column called Romancing the Globe, and there are a lot of relatively a lot of African romance authors. There's Love Africa Press. I believe another one was Ankara Press.
Yep.
And there are also more so independent indie African authors like Kirute, Nana, I'm blanking on her last name. Nana Pra, thank you. And yeah, there are several indie African authors, and there's also, I wouldn't call it an exact corollary for genre romance, but there are the Hausa Muslim African romance writers who, a few years ago, there was a whole thing because there was like a photo spread of them, and it was kind of shared through the lens of like these women writing in the face of Boko Haram, and it was kind of like, it was great that they got recognition, but it wasn't recognition for being authors. It was recognition, like they were kind of treated in the same way as like a Save the Children campaign. And then I was talking to these authors, and they were like academics and, way smarter than me. And then people were like, oh, can we like make a GoFundMe for them? And you don't want to GoFundMe, we're just writing books. So but this was years ago, so I'm blanking on people's names, but but those books are not exact corollaries for like genre romance with happily ever afters. It kind of, I guess, would be like women's fiction, but strong romantic elements. But so there is a market in Africa, and also Mills and Boon is extremely popular. So there are people who grew up reading like the same books that we grew up reading, and who then also, became romance writers because of that.
Thanks so much. I just don't know why I never put the two things together in my brain. It's like, so now I've learned a lot.
This is great. We're modeling teaching and learning on this panel. And Alyssa, this is also making me think about your Princess in Theory and Reluctant Royals in terms of setting things in Africa as well. I guess that's not historical, but it's more contemporary.
Yeah, those are contemporary. They're semi-fantasy because I make up all of the kingdoms and the series. I think maybe the only real one is like there's a book set in Scotland, but it doesn't really directly address. The hero in the book is the Duke of Edinburgh, and people are like, "That's not what they did." And I'm like, "Look, I know this is." Oh, yeah, crap. Duke of Edinburgh. So like, yeah, for those books, I did try to draw on history of the regions that I was setting the books in to come up with a space that could have realistically evolved, realistically in a romance novel sense, that as far as culture, the religions I made up for the book, and how their kingdoms would operate. I did try to research and not just completely make it up whole cloth, because I was aware that there are African romance writers, so I didn't want to just, come in and be like, I'm writing books set in Africa and I'm going to make it up and be like, just completely make it up and not even be respectful of the romance writers and the people who are living there who do read and pick up books, which we often don't think about in the West. Like, I won't get into all that. But, so yeah, I was just trying to come up with kingdoms. I did want to show African royalty in a modern sense. And one of the funny things to me is like, after I wrote, it was seen as like this fantastical thing, but I've received so many articles of women who marry secret African princes. Princess in Theory. So this is like one of the most realistic books I've ever read.
Oh yeah, there are many of them. My father's a chief.
I mean, I think there is actually like a venerable tradition of setting romance novels in made-up countries, right? I mean, have you ever picked up a Harlequin Presents, right? There are these sort of fake sheikhdoms and, tiny European principalities. And so I think that is really, every romance novel is a fantasy in some sense, but I think those fantastical and speculative elements are really, as I said, they've been with us a really long time. Yeah. What's different is putting Black people at the center, right? And that same kind of set of made-up ideas about who gets to be, the secret prince, right? Or the real prince, and who gets to be the sheikh and who gets to be the ruler of, the small kingdom nestled in the Alps that is actually secretly tremendously wealthy, but still needs to be brought into the 21st century by its progressive ruler and his American love interest.
I think something that's interesting about that, I recently I did the introduction for a book by Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins of Contending Forces. She was a Black author of the early 20th century. And she also has a book, not the book that not Contending Forces, I'm blanking on the name of the other book right now, but there is a man who finds out he is African royalty, who goes to Africa. And it has many of the elements, and again, those are early romances, so they don't align exactly with the romance novels we see today. But one of the most interesting things to me in learning about her and what she was writing about, and the other authors who were writing, other Black romance authors who were writing at that time, is like many of the things that they were writing about and the reasons why they were writing. She also has, articles about writing genre romance in order to better share history and information and the human eye, show people that people are humans too, this being like right during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. And so we kind of always have these things, but they just kind of get buried because the establishment doesn't see them as important. And then they're kind of a cyclical thing of like, the books existing, the writer getting work, and then those books being forgotten, then being brought up again as the new wave of the news cycle starts.
Yeah.
So I do think it's important to also, even though I just found out, understand that like we always have been part of pretty much any genre trope, any aspect of romance, but then it just kind of gets forgotten, like how people until recently didn't even know RWA was started by a Black woman. And that's recent history.
Yeah.
So I think, it's interesting to just keep in mind that like diversity and all these things are not new. They just have to keep getting refreshed because they get, I wouldn't say forgotten, erased is probably more accurate, but yeah.
And so as you all are doing that work, and specifically of showing the deep historical work that goes into telling these stories, I'm curious how you make that visible. And if you can talk a little bit more about your research process, but then also like how you share that with authors, both through the story, but also things like the author's note at the end of talking about the research process.
Or the bibliography, if you're
The bibliography, yeah.
Miss Bev or Alyssa, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I make sure, like, I kind of like choose a theme for the book I'm reading. So, cause I could research forever, and that can impact my deadlines. So I choose a theme. So I'm gonna do reproductive justice, for example, for this book, and so I focus my research on that, and then I try to kind of keep my bibliography. Like, I think the first conversation I had with Ms. Bev at one of the RWAs, I told her, I want to write historical. And she was like, make sure you have a bibliography. Keep your sources because they will ask. And so I make sure that, but there's also, for me, like, it's important too to highlight, for me, because I am writing Dominican people, and, people ask me all the time, like, are you going to write people from other places? And I'm like, I could write 100 years and I would not be done writing about Dominican people. So it's important to me to talk about like Dominican Studies Institute at the City College of New York, which has been like my number one support for all my research. It's a huge archive of Dominican history, literally from like the 1500s up to now. And so to me, every time I write a book, I write like a love letter to Jensen Ortiz, the librarian at the City College, because he is this institute is for people, and they are literally like have created an archive for us who don't know about our own history. Like, we don't know the things that we have been doing even here in this country for like 100 years. And so that part too is important to me, because that's part of what we're doing too. And when we're writing these books, it's like we're like, as Alyssa was saying, we're like talking about these scholars that have been doing the work and doing this research for decades, and they're, like, no one knows like that they're out there.
Thank you. That's so powerful. Alyssa?
I guess as far as research, my research is very chaotic because I am chaotic. I often get an idea for a book when I randomly see somewhere some kind of historical information that elicits strong emotion from me. Like Be Not Afraid, which is a book that Kat, I'm not sure which name to call you right now, mentioned earlier, started because I went to Washington, D.C. to the museums for the first time, even though my family is from there. And I went to where they have the Declaration of Independence, and I was just overcome with like anger. Like, this is my emotion when I saw it. And so randomly at that place, I was already mad, and then I went to another room and they had an exhibit about Black Americans during the Revolutionary War. And there was just like this, little exhibit, and it was like many Black Americans were allowed to fight in their patriot masters' place in the war and were promised freedom. And unfortunately, many of them found out that was a lie after the war was over. And it was just like kind of written so without any kind of emotion. So I was pretty pissed off, and I was just like, all right, I didn't know about this. I'm going to research this. And I researched more about it and about the Black loyalists and about the kind of decisions that people had to make during the war. And because I grew up in like, you know, an American Civil War area where there are all these monuments and stuff like that. And I had no idea that Black people were, how deeply involved we were in the American Civil War. So that kind of sparked that. An Extraordinary Union was because I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' blog, and he was writing about American spies during the Civil War. And so things like that. Agnes Moore's Wild Night, because I read about, I saw a tweet from Medieval in Color, what was the account, Medieval in Color, about a Black woman in King James IV of Scotland's court. Wow. So things like that, it can take us, like, so basically I have like the spark, and then I go and start researching, either, you know, usually not at libraries because I mostly was not in the US while writing those, but online libraries, looking at bibliography. And this is also the other use of bibliographies and why I put them in my books too. Like Adriana said, to give people credit, but also to, and you know, also because people are going to say this isn't true, which doesn't stop people from saying that, unfortunately. You can still say, go look at the bibliography. But also because one of the things most helpful to me with the way I research is I look at, when I'm researching something, I see what they reference, and then I go to what they referenced in the bibliography, and I research that, and that kind of leads to stepping stones to find the information that I actually need. So I think with historical research, there are so many different sources now, thanks to the internet. Like even Tumblr can take you down, you know, TikTok, it can take you down rabbit holes as you're researching to see if what the person said was actually true. And then you find like a treasure trove of information about something you had never heard about before.
And just hearing about these little sparks of lines that capture your imagination and then start the idea for a book.
This is my job. This is my job. I mean, this is literally, I have loved Black history all my life. I stumbled into this degree because I love Black history, and I also understood that I didn't know enough. Did not mean to be a professor. You make mistakes, but I just wanted to learn. And so every class I teach is an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more. Every book I teach is an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more. And you really never know what is going to be the thing that sparks a book idea, or for me sparks a different class, or sends me in search of another book. I also read a lot of historical fiction, which thankfully is a space where Black authors flourish. And so there is just so much to find. I'm right now reading Dolan Perkins Valdez' Take My Hand, which is heartbreaking and beautiful. And there is, I am perpetually learning, mostly because if I wasn't, I would, that is my personality, right? And you can learn something from anywhere, but my brain is maybe a little chaotic like Alyssa's, because I just store it in the back of my brain, and then 3 years later I'm like, I have an idea. And my students are like, would have been great if you had that idea when you were teaching this class, but whatever.
We were talking earlier about balancing the academic writing and the romance writing, and just the academic life and romance writing life. Can you say more about that?
I mean, so in my training, I am always writing for, and have been my entire career, writing for the widest possible audience. Which caused a lot of friction when I was getting my degree, in that I was trying not to use language, jargon, so that it was inaccessible. Even as I was talking about concepts that were often only found in academia, but I was not writing about people in academia. I was writing about people who were on the ground and who had left this sort of beautiful treasure trove of, you know, pamphlets and newsletters, and some of them had oral histories, songs. I love art, so I was writing about, like, you know, novels and other kind of poetry. And so I always actually struggled with academic writing, because what I wanted to write was stuff that, like, my mother could read, or things that, like, my grandfather, who was illiterate, same, I do that. My grandfather, who was illiterate, I wanted him to be able to sort of understand what I was doing. Those are my audiences. And so writing fiction was a release, but also pleasurable, and a space where I could sort of think about all the stuff, taking all the stuff that I was learning into this other realm.
I want to move back to something that Adriana was talking about at the beginning, in terms of the learning that's happening about intimacy and how ideas of consent are changing. So let's talk about romance as a space for learning, teaching and learning about sex and about intimacy, about taboo, and how you're thinking about that in your writing and also in your reading.
So let me jump in here. One of the things about reading the in-depth novels, which start being written in the 1990s, and you know, the most recent one, which I think is number 57, was published on Tuesday. So this is like shelves and shelves and shelves of books. Part of what was really interesting to me looking at these mid-90s books, which are imagining a New York circa 2058, right? So they're futuristic, kind of speculative, is what they're imagining for this future. What is the kind of radical future that's being imagined? And one of the things that, for Nora Roberts writing as J.D. Robb, she imagines as sort of normal in this world in the middle of the 21st century, is that same-sex marriage is a normal thing. And so reading one of these books in 2023, we look at that and we think, okay, sure, fine, like same-sex marriage. In 1995, nobody was talking about that, right? It wasn't that gay people didn't exist, but it was that same-sex marriage was not part of the agenda. So by situating her novels in that way, it could be this kind of radically different space. So this is Adriana's point about, like, if you look at novels being written during a time period, you get a sense of the ethos and the vibe of what's happening during that time period. But looking at speculative novels, you see both kind of what they're imagining, but also it tells you a lot about when they're being written. And I think too often, romance moves fast. Romance moves fast, and they are more reflective of what is kind of in the air than maybe any other cultural form. And you see it as guideline shift, and you see it as norm shift. But if you pick up, you know, a Mills and Boon from 1980 and one from 1988, the difference is huge. And if you look at 1998, like it's a really different universe. Now that's not necessarily lessons for today, but as someone who's interested in thinking about these as cultural products, that's hugely valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I do think of romance as like something that is kind of like a barometer for what, like how people were thinking about sex and intimacy and the places where they could go. And I think that's part of why people who don't read romance and see the intensity that romance readers have around their love for romance don't have, I think part of the lack of understanding and insight is that it is something that really can speak to things that you can't tell yourself. Like, I know that for me as a reader, like more than as an author, like there's so many things I have understood about my own sexuality and my own desire from reading romance. And I think that's part of why we react to it so strongly, because sometimes it is giving us insight into things about ourselves that we can't necessarily name because we are were socialized as, I mean, I grew up in the Dominican Republic. I lived there till I was 23 years old in the 90s, knowing I liked girls and boys. And so how do you, I couldn't even tell that to myself truly until like I moved to the US when I was 23. And so like, romance allows us to like be able to have conversations with ourselves about these desires and these wants that we have and these yearnings. And when you read that, when you're reading something that someone that's having that same experience, it unlocks you. And that's why like we are like rabid about it, like why we are so intense. And to me as a writer, then my job is as someone writing Black Latina women who are sometimes in relationship with people from another race, sometimes from their same race, right? Thinking about colorism in our communities, thinking about the complicated bodies that we're in, bodies that are like, 40% Spaniard, 40% African, and what that means, and how we came to be. And then you have Catholicism, right? And like, to me, to write books about women who understand their own desires and can have an equitable relationship with someone that is there to honor their desires. I mean, I think that's the work of like social justice.
Mm-hmm. It's occurring to me that,
Yeah.
So I grew up in a Pentecostal, very religious family. And we didn't really have sex education of any kind. I mean, it was sort of like, don't do it. And if you do, you'll end up pregnant or dead. And if you're lucky, in the opposite order. But yeah, it's so this is what Adriana is saying. It hit me like it never. This is how I learned about sex. Is through these books. It's like
all of us did.
I think I'm always sort of struggling with, again, as a teacher, the way in which we have these ideas that like sexuality now is as free as it's ever been. And so that usually leads us into thinking that there are not sexual possibilities or sexual diversity in the past. And I'm also sort of combating this idea that a lot of people have when they enter a history classroom, which is that the only sort of appropriate primary sources are governmental documents and whatever memoirs some like old dead politician left in like a dusty corner, which I don't teach. And so I'm always trying to get students, I'm a social and cultural historian, so I'm always trying to get students to think about the way in which people lived their lives. And they lived their lives loving one another. We are here because someone somewhere, lots of someone somewhere, had hopefully a whole bunch of sex that they enjoyed. And it would be inappropriate of me to teach history as if that is not the case. And so I am always sort of thinking about how I can put not just sex, but also, love and emotion, right? Like these are things that matter, especially when, because of what I study and because of what I teach, the only time they might hear a conversation about sex is rape. And I really need to, and I do a lot of work to have them rethink that as the only association of any kind of intimacy. And so I want to talk to them about, for instance, the consensual relationships between enslaved people, right? And then the sacrifices they make for the children born out of those relationships, or that they are forced to make out of those relationships. I want to talk to them about like the intimacy of like family and community, right? So I'm always trying to think about, when I'm bringing a text into the classroom, like how can I do that most effectively? So she talked about it yesterday, but like the way Miss Bev begins Indigo is the most perfect encapsulation of all of that, right? Or even Alyssa's Be Not Afraid, which ends with the adoption of this orphaned enslaved woman by these two people who, again, are looking for freedom and safety, and they find that with one another and they give that to this girl, right? And then also That Could Be Enough, which is like 2 generations later, so it's a whole thing, right? But like I'm always trying to think about how I can shake up my students' understanding of how people in the past lived their lives, and I want to bring them texts that allow them to do that.
Yeah. I just want to add something, just speaking to that, which you reminded me, thank you, is I've said this before, but when I came to the U.S., I came to the U.S. when I was 23, and I had never really thought about my blackness in like any like deep way, because I was in the Dominican Republic where everybody's some kind of shade of brown, and then there's the white people that have money. Yeah. And so like even though there's a lot of colorism and there's like so many complicated issues in terms of our the way that we are, our history with Haiti, still like I could walk down the street and like, you know, I was not in the minority. But when I came to the US, like I realized, oh, okay, I have to think about this differently. And so I began to read a lot of like James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, like trying to educate myself and just kind of like the Black experience in America, which was not mine until, you know, it's not mine, and I didn't like know deeply about it until I came here. And I found Miss Bev's books in the library, and it gave me a sense of that, exactly that, of like how people lived. Like it's because of course like James Baldwin is like incredibly important to me in my education and like learning of myself, but it was so nice to read about people falling in love and like people just having jobs, like, you know, like having jobs and going out there, and it is like I deeply treasure that having found them, because if not, all I would have been reading were things that were difficult to read. Yeah.
Right.
I could talk about this for like 2 hours, so I'm going to try and condense that to 3 minutes. So intimacy and sex and romance, I feel like is such an important thing, in part because Western society really detests emotion and connection. So like society will push people to get married and kind of make it seem like it's mandatory that you have to get married, have a relationship, but there's no discussion really of the good aspects of that. Every sitcom has a wife that's a pain in the ass to the husband who doesn't really care what his wife wants, but then they hug at the end of the episode because they love each other, because that's what marriage is. So I feel like romance novels in many ways like really are deep dives into the mechanics of relationships, all different kinds of relationships, all different problems that couples might encounter, you know, from mundane things to like having to save the world. And they put it in a way that's, I feel like it's instructive to readers in a way that often, well, I feel like now it's starting to get a little iffy, which I have an issue with, but generally in romance, if someone is a bad person or is mistreating the heroine, they are not her hero. And in a way, it's kind of conditioning readers to understand that if someone treats you in this way, if they don't respect you, if they don't respect your needs, if they don't want you to succeed, that is not the person that is meant for you or that you should be with. And it's not always, generally not explicitly said, but it's something, and especially because romance readers read so many books generally, that after reading again and again, it's kind of helps people to form a pattern of like, okay, oh no, this person is treating me like crap, this is not what I should want. And also to, you know, explore, before you even get to the sex part, just the intimacy and ways that people relate to each other, and even intimacy between friends and family, and how to navigate, you know, issues and communication in platonic ways. So I feel like romance novels really don't get enough respect for how much work authors put into kind of, it's not generally at top of mind, but it's just kind of a side effect of what you're writing, is that it's kind of, in a way, instructional. Like, okay, this kind of behavior is a red flag. This kind of behavior is something that, you know, maybe you could consider. And I was thinking about this when Adriana was talking about how she felt reading the books. Is that like when they did, you know, neuroscientific research, and basically when you're reading a book, your brain can't tell the difference between whether it's really happening to you or whether, you know, if it's just fiction. So when you are reading these accounts of people being treated well, thoroughly loved, having these deep connections, your brain is on some level understanding that and maybe taking that in as a way of moving forward in life. So I do think that romance fiction really affects people's lives in a much deeper level than it's given credit for. And I guess the other thing I would talk about as far as like instructional, educational, is the way that this can also work for neurodivergent people. I'm neurodivergent. And honestly, before I knew this, I would get feedback from readers who were like, I find your book so helpful because they like clearly lay out the relationships between the people and how you can communicate when there's an issue and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, thank you. And then like later on, I was like, oh, okay. That's because like I also have to think about those things like as I'm writing it and generally in my own life because I'm neurodivergent too. So that's another educational function as far as people who are outside the norm of what is considered a romance reader, educational events that you can pick up from a romance novel, kind of having a representation of like figuring out how to approach problems and how to solve them in relationships. And I guess the last thing is like, since like you guys were already talking about like coming from backgrounds that really repress sexuality, and I think that there is such a spectrum of the ways that romance can really be great for people who have come from those backgrounds, whether they're like super explicit, like, you know, like Kit Roche's Beyond series, I feel like has been really great for so many people. It's like set in the future. In addition to like the world building and stuff like that, there are like orgies and open sexuality and presented in a way that resonated with many people because they came from backgrounds where they were that was only shown as something purely sexual without intimacy, without love, and so that was something for people who came from like, you know, more repressed backgrounds. But the other aspect is also books where the characters are reticent about sex and are learning new things. This is why I don't get into the whole, I don't want to read about virgin heroines. Virgin heroines exist in real life, and they need books too. So, like, I feel like there's a gamut where, you know, there's a kind of book for everyone, and there are so many ways that romance can kind of enhance people's understanding of their own sexuality across the spectrum.
Thank you. You condensed 2 hours beautifully into you gave us so much to think about. We keep acknowledging Beverly Jenkins, and I want to give her a shout out here. So much appreciated.
I think my generation, we just wrote. Mm-hmm. We didn't think about it. And I listen to you young women and how you break it down. I could listen to you all fucking day. You go places that in 1994 I never even thought about. You know, Ariana talking about being...
Got a microphone.
Oh. Sorry. You know, Adriana talking about being part black, part Hispanic, part... You know, we never thought about any of that when we're writing. And you guys bring a personalization to romance that has never been dealt with before. And like I said, I can listen. You teach me. You absolutely do teach me. Alyssa, Katrina, I don't know you in the middle. I'm sorry. But Adriana, I mean, thank you for your insight, for your intelligence. You know, we hate using the word articulation, but for that also. So, carry on.
Well, I've got more questions. I don't know. I don't know if people want to jump in, but if the audience wants to start asking questions too, we can start taking audience questions, and then if there's time, I can go back to my prepared questions. But I think Beverly Jenkins said it best in terms of all the learning that's happening through the reading, through the conversations, and it's just so much fun to be here. Maggie.
Oh, good morning. Hi, I'm Maggie North. I'm a romance author from Canada. It's a real pleasure to be here and listen to all you brilliant people. So I have a question about, let's see if I can stay composed under pressure, about Deb's point that romance is a space for teaching and learning. And the point that has been made a couple of times at this conference that romance is really plugged into the forefront of our cultural zeitgeist and it moves fast. So as an author, you become, in a way, a public figure where your teaching and learning journey is archived. So when you have like the past you, like maybe to the authors who have a body of work, and maybe even if Ms. Bev wants to aim a zinger at me, how do you grapple with your teaching and learning journey being in the public record?
Anyone want to jump in and grab that question?
I don't think I've ever really thought about that. I mean, I do think about like what happens if I write something that upsets someone or that I get wrong. But I feel like if that happens, I would, of course, feel bad because I wrote something that was not correct, number one, but that also hurt someone. So I think I don't really like grapple with it. I more try to think of if that happens, how will I fix it more so than, and if it's something as far as like books becoming outdated and things like that, it just, with that kind of thing, it just is. But like, you know, I read older romance novels where I see something, I'm like, oh, you know, I wouldn't put that in a book now, but this author probably wouldn't put that in a book now either. And I think that's part of the thing too, if someone has a long bibliography, if it never changes, if there isn't an arc of growth that is seen in their book, then I think maybe readers might have a problem with it. But if there's something that, you know, was normal at the time and they see you're writing now and you are not writing that anymore, I don't think most readers would feel a need to like call you out on it or hold it against you. So
Can I also chime in here, because one of the things is it's not just your teaching and learning journey, it's a dialogue, right? Because romance authors aren't just documenting, they're also shaping the popular culture around romance and sexuality and consent. So, you know, there's a movement, right? Novelists are doing things, society is doing things, and there's a kind of feedback loop there, right? We experience this as academics, as historians, right? You write something working on documents, and then 5 years later, or, you know, it's history and archives, so maybe it's like 8 or 10 years later, somebody publishes a book and says, oh, you know, Professor Jackson was actually wrong about X because I know why.
Let's not do that.
Excuse me. Kecia Ali was wrong about X. I've had that happen, right? But if I hadn't published that thing that they're now saying was wrong, they wouldn't have gone and done the research to do this other thing. So, you know, this is all very much a collective kind of process. I don't know if that helps from your perspective. It's been very reassuring to me for mine every time a new book comes out that says I did something wrong, right?
And Beverly Jenkins, did you want to respond thinking about the trajectory of things that you've, like the learning that's happened over the course of writing?
You're talking about the things I've learned, or you're talking about the things the genre has learned?
I guess that speaking to Maggie's question about the things that you've learned, or having your learning be documented from successive book to successive book.
Well, you know, the fact that Night Song is still in print is amazing to me, because it was published in 1994. The fact that they're using my novels at a college level is also amazing to me. That I'm on my 4th generation of readers. So you have young women who are now at Yale reading my books, and their grandmothers, and all of the women in between. And it's what I wished for all of these young women at this table, to have that longevity, because when you educate a woman, you educate a race.
Yes.
And to be able to pass that stuff down is amazing. To hear people say, well, I started writing because of your books, Miss Beth. It makes me cry. Because it lets me know that I'm on the right path, that I've made the path wider, which is my job, which is why my Twitter is filled with everybody's books but mine. We owe it to each other and to those coming up behind us to reach back, whether it's with contemporary romance, whether it's with historical romance, and to give people, I never saw myself on a page growing up. And the great Tony says, you know, if there's a book out there that you want to read that's not there, your ass need to write it. And basically that's what we're doing. We're making it up as we go along so that we can see ourselves on the page, so the young girls at church can see themselves on the page, so your granddaughters, if you decide to do that, will see themselves on the page. And it's very, very important. You know, that cliche representation matters. Yes, it does. And you matter to me. So thank you.
Can I actually? Can I also say, though, there's a specific way, as an unofficial Miss Beth scholar, in her early books, everyone is straight, but in Rebel, there's a queer couple as a background character. So we've seen over the course of your own career, right, that the world can open up just a little bit more. And I imagine that is because there are other authors like Alyssa and Rebecca who are writing queer characters at the time, right? So I actually think there's a lot of learning over the body of your career as well.
Not a fiction writer, come from a nonfiction journalist background, so hence the question. So you're finally at a place with historical fiction where we're seeing the stories and telling the stories we didn't know before, and being used on college campuses, which is excellent. And at the same time, there is a very serious book banning and another whole series of efforts at the local level and nationally to obliterate truth, reframe narratives, and stamp out voices. So as you are using these works now in your work, your daily work, wondering if you felt any pressures. Are you having to adapt or change how you present the material? What suggestions you might have for others who are facing that and you figured out a way to get around it, and actually what your response is to it?
I mean, I think part of it, to be frank, is that like romance as a genre, because, for example, I write historical romance, and so I'm writing about like queer women, and I'm writing about like I'm having conversations about like, well, how did these aristocrats get their money? And I'm writing about reproductive justice. I'm writing about abortion. I'm writing contraception. And part of the challenge is finding reference texts, even within the historical romance space, that, like, of course, there are authors that have been doing it, but there's not many of us, right? And so, like, that's part of the challenge, even within our genre, of, like, taking those risks, because you kind of, we are kind of kind of like pushing the boundaries as we go, because the genre also, like for a long time, was like in a very, very comfortable small spot, right? And so like we're kind of like put like people like Alyssa, people like Ms. Beth, people like Courtney Milan have like really like expanded like what the historical space could look like, right? So that's one thing. So even within that, like you're having to question, if you're like in the traditionally published space, like with your editors, like how far can I go? Like right now I'm writing a book. I mean, it was not supposed to be about reproductive justice, but she is a doctor in 1889, and like Roe v. Wade happened last year, and I was like really mad, and still am. So like my book, like my focus of how that book is gonna play out has changed because of what's happening right now in this country. And like as I'm writing it, like 19 attorney generals are asking to be able to like get federal records so they can arrest women for going out of state for an abortion. And so like I am like writing from that place, and I'm looking for text in my own genre to see how that's been treated. And there's not much I can find. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is always looking, like knowing that like romance is already at a disadvantage in terms of like being taken seriously. And then like once you kind of go to the voices that are writing about this stuff, like you do have like I mean, I'm not getting any pushback from my publisher, but they have not gotten the manuscript yet. But like also I know that like as I do this, like I'm pushing a boundary, but like that's the job.
Thank you, everybody, for this. This is like...
Oh, wait, hang on.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I don't feel it or honestly think about it in romance. I am, however, a Black historian who teaches Black history. I think that one of the things that I've learned over the course of my career is how deeply anti-intellectual spaces can be, and how that directly connects to then an erasure of and a suppression of history, right? And so for me, in a state like Ohio, I am always being honest with my students about the historical record. Not because it will ever save me, like if they want to report me for teaching like critical race theory, which is not what I do because I'm not a lawyer, they can. It doesn't change the historical record, right? But I also, at the same time, which is why it's so important for me to teach them how to think about the messaging they get in historical narratives, to also think about how that messaging can be used to suppress history. And so it matters for me that whatever happens in my own career, that I'm able to teach my students to ask critical questions about the historical narratives that they're giving, which is also part of my pedagogy. My students interrupt me as I lecture because I want to teach them, and I do teach them, that this is a dialogue. I am a subject matter expert, but I don't know everything, right? So if they can learn how to question a narrative, if they can learn how to critically piece apart the language that's being used, or a body of evidence that's being used in a particular way, then I can teach them that outside of the classroom, they can do that as well. I don't think there's a whole bunch individual people or even collective people can do to stop this particular tide. I'm a bit pessimistic in this year, but I don't think that there's a whole bunch we can do to stop the tide, but I also don't think this is the end, right? And part of the way that I understand my job's importance is that when my students leave my classroom, they are able to ask those questions, and they are able to look at the narratives that they are getting and think critically.
I don't really teach anything, but as far as thinking about the pushback, as far as authors receiving pushbacks or possibly our books getting banned or things like that, my publishers have always been extremely supportive about what I write, and I've never really gotten I've never gotten pushback about any of the kind of social justice or social commentaries that have gone into my books. I think one thing that I have been kind of worried about as we proceed with having more diverse books is a kind of more insidious way of so kind of think of the way to phrase this. I think we should be paying attention to what publishers are publishing and making sure that they don't start trying to kind of whitewash historicals or books about queer people or books about marginalized groups by attaching it to the more dominant narrative. Like I started to notice a trend in historical fiction, and I'm not saying anything bad about these books at all, but I'm seeing more books about like a Black person with a white, I'm not talking about romantically, but like in history. Like here is like a Black person who's friends with a white person. And like, I personally don't see that, like what is interesting about that, because Black people make Black friends all the time. So, but I'm just like in the sense of like how are ways that publishers might be trying to get around things that might be uncomfortable, or if they fear backlash over something, is kind of not pushing for more challenging narratives and going more of like the Green Book type route. The Green Book's a movie. I don't know what the Green Book the book was like. So that's something that I think about as an author, and like for things I might encounter when pitching in the future, or ways that publishers might see if things get worse with the book banning and stuff like that. So, and again, there's not like much that we can individually do, but I guess just kind of keeping an eye on things and supporting the books that you enjoy that might be banned.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for all of the work that went into this and the dialogue. Like, how many panels have we all been to where there's no dialogue and you're like, why aren't they talking to each other? This is an almost fully formed question, but just bear with me. Throughout the course of yesterday and today, I'm thinking about, like, here is this magical genre that's, like, so disrespected and ignored. And, like, we talk about the history behind it. And thank you for teaching romance in your class, because I would think a lot more kids would be engaged in reading if they were reading things that were entertaining and enjoyable. But how much do you think romance gets to be subversive because it is disrespected, and profitable? And people aren't banning romances because they're not respected, right? So people don't understand the power behind romance. Like, everybody who has spoken about hiding romance from, like, all these other people, and people wouldn't be scared of it if it wasn't kind of powerful, right? Like, you learn about sex, you learn about all these things that we as a society are terrified of. But what do you think would happen? Maybe this is my question. If romance was fully respected for everything that it does for the culture, would that sort of ruin that subversive magic that happens? Or, like, where does your brain sort of, that's what my brain right now is struggling with.
I mean, given that we are in a white supremacy and a patriarchy, if romance was everyone's favorite, we would be doing it wrong. I feel like, I mean, part of it is that, right? Like, I think if like the establishment, right, would think romance is great, everyone should read it. I read it all the time. Like, if Mitch McConnell was talking about romance, then we would be doing something like seriously bad. We would be on the wrong path.
Or we would have elected the right people. Like, maybe we get to that point.
I'm really loath to actually talk about the genre as subversive as a whole, because it's not, right? So I think there's something to be said. And also, as Kecia was saying, and as Adriana was saying, it is about the time period, right? So what is subversive in 1994 is not subversive in 2004, is not subversive today, right? So I think keeping that in mind, and also on some level that is also individual. So if you are coming from a background where your family is not talking to you about sex and you are not having those conversations, you know, a low heat might feel like a high heat, right? Or not, I don't know. But I do think that for the things that I'm it's also important to be like, this is what I'm interested in, right? These are my areas of interest and expertise, and this is what I find subversive, because it is doing such great work, which is also why I have spent a lot of my time here talking about Beverly Jenkins and Alyssa Cole, because I think at the different points of their career, when Indigo and, for instance, Be Not Afraid were written, that was subversive. To write about Black people in these time periods when historical romance looked the way that it looked, which is not actually that different in those two time periods, but I digress. But that is subversive, right? What will be subversive in 20 years after you have this, I don't want to call it a wave, a growing puddle of diverse historical romances? What will be subversive in 20 years will look totally different. And so I think there is this way that we talk about romance that I've said this before, and it's sort of frustrating, but we talk about romance by its exceptions, not the rule. And in my opinion, the rule is not subversive. The exceptions are, and the exceptions are absolutely fantastic.
I guess I just add one thing that I do think that, not on like a wide scale, but I do think there are some attempts now that people have started to notice that romance is profitable to kind of hijack it. And this is kind of related to my whole thing about how people don't like emotion. Well, they don't like love. They like anger, but they don't like love. So there is a lot of pushback against kind of like happy stories. You can see this in more so in movie and TV, but it does bleed over into romance, of people saying, well, romance is good, but like they don't have to have a happy ending for it to be a romance. And you're like, yeah, actually they do. That's the point of romance. And kind of the ways in which people are kind of trying to like hitch onto it because there is money, but also trying to change it. This isn't anything new. But I do think, like, with the renewed attention on romance, there is a way, like, there's one end, the way of trying to make it more palatable, of the illustrated covers with people not touching each other because people can't touch each other because that's gross because we're 5 years old or something. And then the other aspect of, like, well, do they have to stay together at the end? Why, like, don't you want to change that? Wouldn't it be edgier? And like, wouldn't that be like cool? Like, and it's like, no, like you can. There are so many ways to be subversive within the framework of romance as it stands, which people are doing, every day. So I do think I don't think it's like a plot to take over romance, but I do think there are some people who see it as something that can be monetized, but also because they don't respect it, want to change it. So I think that's one aspect. Not directly what the question was about, but like an offshoot of it, I guess.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank everyone on this panel for such a rich conversation.
So, welcome to panel number 3. From Bodice Rippers to Bridgerton, Romance on the Public Stage, which is my favorite panel title of the conference. This panel will discuss, I'll give everybody a second to come in. Okay.
I know Nancy. When I introduce you guys, we're fine. I'm not even worried. Sarah, I didn't so
Alrighty. So this panel will discuss romance's varied public receptions, reputations, and material transformations over the decades, book history and literary scholarship on Black popular fiction, media romance phenomenon, and the groundbreaking oral histories produced by the podcasts of scholars Dr. Julie Moody-Freeman, the Black Romance Podcast, and romance writer Sarah MacLean and romance critic Jen Prokop, amongst many other panelists who I'm going to introduce now. So, as our moderator, we have the reason for the season, Jeannie Moore. Yes. Okay. Junior Rhee is a doctoral student in African American Studies and Religious Studies at Yale. Her research uses religion and theology to analyze effectively changed intersections in African American history and culture, such as romance novels and race and racialization and animalization. She holds an MPhil in theology and religious studies from the University of Cambridge, an MDiv from Emory University, and a BA in humanities from Yale. She is ordained clergy, United Methodist, and is published in the Anglican Theological Review, the International Journal for Theology, Sojourners, and other publications. Yes. And our panelists include Carol Bell. Carol Bell is a Jamaican-born communication researcher, writer, critic with 2 decades of experience working at the intersections of media, culture, and politics. A lover of books, TV, film, and democracy, her writing has appeared in print and digital media outlets, including NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, and the Griot. And she is a contributor to the recent Black Lives Matters essay, Theology. Carol's research focuses on group identity and the societal and political effects and implications of news and entertainment media. She earned her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill School of Media and Journalism, a master's in television and radio from Brooklyn College, and has a bachelor's in English and American literature from Harvard. Her current book project is a multi-method analysis of representation, reception, and social and political significance of Black, white romantic narratives in American film since the Civil Rights Movement. And we have Sarah MacLean, a lifelong romance reader. Sarah MacLean wrote her first romance novel on a dare and never looked back. She is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of romances translated into more than 25 languages, a romance columnist and co-host of the weekly romance novel podcast, Fated Mates. A graduate of Smith College and Harvard University, she lives in New York City. Her latest novel, Knockout, was released in August. Congrats. Then we have Julie Moody-Freeman. Julie Moody-Freeman is the director of the Center for Black Diaspora, co-director of the Social Transformation Research Collaborative, and an associate professor in the Department of African and Black Diaspora Studies at DePaul University. She is the co-editor of The Black Imagination, Science Fiction, and the Speculative, and The Black Imagination, Science Fiction, Futurism, and the Speculative. Her work on African American romance has appeared in Romance Fiction and American Culture, the Routledge Research Companion to Popular Romance Fiction, the Journal for Popular Romance Studies, and Black Lives Matters, Real Talk on Romance, Also Being Seen, and Happily Ever Afters. She is also the creator and host of the Black Romance Podcast, which is building an oral history on Black romance writers. Kinohi Nishikawa is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he conducts research in African American print and popular cultures. He is the author of Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction and the Making of a Literary Underground, and he is currently writing Black Paratext, a history of modern African American literature and book design. Nishikawa is editor of the forthcoming 1990s volume of the series African American Literature in Transition. He has also edited special issues of the journals American Literature and Post-45 Contemporaries. His writing on Black independent publishing from the Black arts movement to contemporary urban fiction has appeared in PMLA, MELUS, and American Literary History, as well as the collections Are You Entertained? Black Popular Culture in the 21st Century, and the Edinburgh History of Reading. Yes. And then we have Jen Prokop. Jen's lifelong romance habit began in 7th grade, where she found a bag of remaindered romance novels in her grandmother's basement. It's a common thread this conference. She co-hosts the podcast Fated Mates and reviews romance for Kirkus. A graduate of Villanova University and Northwestern University, Jen currently lives with her family in Chicago. Amazing. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. And before we get started on, or maybe as a way to start the questions, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge everyone who's up here, but especially Jen, Sarah, and Julie. You don't know this, you were my first teachers in terms of romance in the field. Your podcasts are incredible. So can we just... I want to use that as a way maybe to open our discussion about book history and thinking more broadly about, the material transformations of these books I learned about really from you. And by that, I mean, not popular romance studies as like an academic branch, but romance itself as a field, the books. And so I'm wondering if you can share, maybe starting with Julie and then Sarah and Jen, what led you to start your podcast? You have such diverse backgrounds and gifts.
Oh. She said Julie first.
Right. Yeah, I think I want to go before I even started the podcast, because before I did the podcast, and I'm saying this because what I did influenced the podcast. So before I did it, my research and my publication, whatever presentation I made, and primarily it was made at YASPR, right? So the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance. I was mostly presenting on romance novels that had these racial uplift story. It sort of the writers focused on representations of agape and erotic love. And so I was always drawn to the novels where the setting for love stories between Black characters were centered in these nonprofit organizations, centers, healthcare centers, education, after school. And then together the characters fell in love, worked to alleviate a number of social issues that faced Black people: HIV, AIDS, welfare, poverty, crime, and violence as a result of institutionalization of racism and capitalism. So I kept studying that. And so when I thought about doing the podcast, and I really wanted the podcast on a public stage because I didn't want it, of course it was during COVID, and I was like, yes, we can do this by Zoom. I don't have to necessarily travel to the writers. And so I wanted to be it on a public stage because I didn't want it behind a paywall. I had done an issue of a journal. Actually, it was for the Routledge Companion. I had done something on African American romance, it focused on scholarly resources that had been published on African romance, and it was hard to find. And so I'm like, I would love to have something so that people coming behind me would have. And so that is why I decided to do the podcast, so that it could reach everybody. And then I am a romance reader. So I'm like, okay, it's for academia, but it's also for the readers. And then I'm like, but it could also be for the writers. So that was why I put it in that public stage. But the focus of it was, and it evolved over time, but the focus was always choosing those writers who focused on centers and focused on this idea of racial uplift. So I'll stop there because you'll probably have more questions.
That's fantastic. Sarah and Jen.
Well, we have a different path that comes through paranormal romance and community.
Yeah.
I think that we've talked about this all weekend. Every panel has touched on it, but this idea that romance readers are always searching for other people who we can celebrate with and enjoy these books with and talk about these books with and make fun sounds about these books with. And I was in my second read of a paranormal romance series by Cressley Cole called Immortals After Dark. And I was on Twitter screaming about romance novels, which is basically all I want to do all the time. And Jen, who I did not know, but, we were sort of mutuals.
The golden age of romance Twitter is what someone called it yesterday. And I was like, right.
Yeah, we were mutuals. And she said, wait, I love that series too. And I said, oh my God, we should do a podcast. And then she slid into my DMs and was like, we should do a podcast.
I'm going to say
and it was supposed to be 18 episodes.
Yeah, but we're starting season 6 next week. My favorite part about this story, everybody, is Sarah was like, and you slid into my DMs and said, let's do a podcast. And I was like, yes, because I absolutely approach best-selling authors every day and be like, why don't you be my partner in this small effort?
We were fated mates.
We were fated mates.
And then what we ended up doing is deciding it's so exciting to talk about these books that we love, and there was so much instant response from a community of readers, a paranormal community of readers. I mean, they were not paranormal. I mean, maybe. It'd be exciting. Come on the pod if you are. And then we realized, okay, well, we read fast, but we need to give them a middle week. Mm-hmm. And so we started what we called originally the interstitial episodes, which were intended to be, we pick a trope, we slightly, for 10 minutes, deconstruct it, and then recommend 3 books very fast, 20 minutes. Tops. Those are hour-and-a-half-long episodes now, where we deconstruct tropes from the perspective of reader, author, critic. We have guests on, and then, of course, per the panel, for the last 3 years, we've been doing what we call the Trailblazer series, inspired in many ways by the Black Romance podcast, where we speak to the authors who, in our opinion, built the house.
That's you just named what I was going to ask next. That's fantastic. Your Trailblazer series, Julie, your body of work on the podcast, which are oral histories. I mean, this is giving a history of, again, romance as a field, not the study, but the actual text, the contemporary genre as it's evolved since the 70s. That's something that is so valuable. And there's a link to Carol as a journalist. Julie, you make this point in your article on Black romance that African-American romance was really documented by journalists. It wasn't attended to by scholars until quite recently. Yourself and Professor Nishikawa as 2 of the scholars now who are doing that work. But the importance of these other sources and voices like journalists. So Carol, I'm wondering if you can speak about, the articles you've written for Shondaland and other platforms and what you see as someone with a PhD, but writing in a public space.
Well, it's really interesting to me to be someone who's writing for more popular venues now, because I come from academia, and the first place where I talked about romance and the importance, the social and political significance of romance was for my PhD research, right? Like it was in my dissertation. And, and I contended, honestly, it came to me, the importance of this really came to me because I saw an ad for a movie, like 15 years, I don't remember how long ago now. It's about 15 years ago, right? 5 minutes ago. It was just yesterday. And it was so obviously political, and it was an ad for a rom-com. But it was an ad for an interracial rom-com, and it was so obviously political. And I was like, what is that message? What is going on in that scene, And that actually spawned my interest in, okay, these interracial narratives seem to be so freighted and loaded. And I wanted to see what were the ideas that they were expressing and what did that mean. And anyway, so that led to a really long path. And for a long while, my entrance then was through I did focus groups, I did content analysis. I was really interested in the political ideas. But then leaving academia, I wanted to have just a different, a more speaking to normal people, on a regular basis. Okay, well, it was just really coming at it from a different angle, but I still wanted to be able to talk about the social and political significance, but just from attacking it from a really different way. And the first thing that I wrote first for Book Riot and also for Shondaland. And I was just struck by the importance. Again, it just came to me like, from being a consumer of media and discovering very late in life Beverly Jenkins' work and reading Indigo, reading. I don't know if Indigo was not the first one I read, but it was one of the early ones, and reading Alyssa Cole, and I just was amazed by the work that was being done to tell African American history in this work and how that intersected with everything that came before. And luckily, people were really, really receptive. Like Shondaland was really interested in what I had to say about like the work that had been done, and I was absolutely building on work that the people had already been doing in this area, but people were, I have to say, more than anything else I think that I've worked on, people responded. I mean, it was like one of the thing I wrote for Shondaland, I think, was one of the most saved and shared things, around like for weeks, right? And I think people just really wanted to hear about, like, people hadn't, there was an amazing community of romance readers, but there was an amazing community of people who want these stories who don't know about them. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was sort of my journey in wanting to sort of like bring these discoveries to like the broader audience. And that's kind of how I found my way. But really, as a romance reader, I also came at it from just a place of like pleasure, and I've written about this multiple times. I think everybody knows I'm someone who's sometimes in the need of a mood boost, and nothing works better for me than like a really good romance to sort of like change the mood. And so like when I'm in a dark period, I mean, the first year when I was in a really hard period, I literally read 403 books, and the vast majority were romances.
One of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. In good company.
One of my favorite stories is it's a tweet Alicia Rye was talking about getting her hair cut. I don't know if you ever saw this, and the woman said, like, well, what do you do? And she said, I wrote romance. And the woman just said, saving lives. And I like, that tweet lives rent-free, right? Saving lives.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you're in good company here on the stage, but also in this room. Professor Nishikawa, if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about your journey to studying Black popular fiction, and what are some themes when you look at your body of work? You're coming as a literary scholar, a book historian. Tell us what that means and what you see when you look at the books you've studied.
Yeah. My path is probably unique on the stage, and I want to thank you and Professor Edwards and the conference organizers for inviting me to share my story as part of the conversation. Like everyone in this room, I'm a reader. And what I found in academic discussions of literature is that often we don't center readers in terms of how we study literature. We have preset categories of what's important to teach in terms of the literary, that often doesn't take into account communities of readers, whether historical or actually existing in the present. So that very top-down approach is what I knew I wanted to challenge in studying Black popular fiction. But when I started my graduate work in the early 2000s, I ran into the problem of, number one, at the time, not having an archive that was easily accessible, and number two, not having a body of scholarship really to build on. So what you said earlier, I think, really resonated with me, in that fans and journalists were my experts in Black popular fiction when I was starting out. They were the ones I went to for bibliographies. They were the ones I went to for major trends that more or less had not been picked up by scholarship. And in terms of the archive, more or less I collected the archive on my own. And I did so not at Barnes & Noble or Borders, but I did so at Black bookstores, namely the No Bookstore in Durham, North Carolina, which I know Professor Edwards knows, right across from North Carolina Central. She and I went to the same grad program. Library book sales, yard sales, used bookstores, you name it. That was my library, as it were. Not the library, but the book sales, the things that they're selling as they're withdrawn from the collection. So that was really my path that led to my dissertation research and my first book, which was on hard-boiled pulp fiction from the 60s and 70s. And it's only been through coming to this conference and also putting the pulp fiction work behind me that I've returned to the romance novels that I've collected. And that's been a real pleasure to sort of take a look at, because it's pointing me to different communities of readers that I hadn't really taken up in my book, but that I'm looking forward to sharing more about during this session.
It's fantastic. Did you want to share?
No, I can do it in the course of questions.
Okay, great.
No, I'm curious.
I know.
Can we get into this collection?
Yeah. Because I think if there are images of covers of books, covers design is a really controversial, it's a big thing right now in romance in terms of how it's changing, and not just now, how it has changed over time. I think about chic romances or Native American romance, right? Like the role and depiction of race and all the themes, Carol, that you've explored in your work as a journalist and as an academic. Julie, some of the things that you have brought up in your interviews, it's all baked in. So if you do want to share those images, we can. Okay, all right.
That was an excellent. Well, I could. That was a great pivot. I was going to say. So, if you want me,
let's take a look. Let's take a look.
Let's do it. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with Odyssey Books, who.
You might have to get closer.
Oh, we needs to be logged in.
We need a password.
Great.
Yay, Odyssey Books.
I mean,
See, I knew. Yeah.
You made the right call. I'll just go quickly through these because, like Beverly Jenkins said, I'm here to learn from you. Trust me on that. Odyssey Books was founded by Letitia Peoples and operated out of Silver Spring, Maryland. Odyssey brought out Mildred E. Riley's historical romances, including Akena, Sachem's Daughter, which was published in 1992. Peoples started Odyssey in 1990 because she felt like Black women readers were underserved in the romance market. I mean, this is a theme we've already heard so much of. And her desire to meet the real and present need is a common theme in the independent publishing of that decade, which is really my focus. Riley's novel is set in 1644 and features the titular Akena, a Wampanoag woman who finds herself in Spain after being kidnapped by an English captain. An African seaman, Kamsin, rescues Akena and promises to return her to home back across the Atlantic. But it's Kamsin's navigator, Ibraha, who seems to win Akena's heart during that voyage. So what I love about the cover here is that you don't know whether it's Kasim or Ibraha, which I think is kind of nice because the resulting love triangle and intercultural exchange really make the book feel unusually expansive in terms of what's possible for reader identification and romantic interest. So Odyssey is something that I found really interesting.
What was the year again?
1992. Okay. We mentioned interracial romance. Genesis Press was based in Columbus, Mississippi. And already we're hearing about places far-flung from the New York, hub of so much corporate media, right? Silver Spring, Columbus, Mississippi. It brought out two lines of Black romance fiction, Indigo and Love Spectrum. Headed by Dorothy and Wilbur Collum, the far-flung Genesis managed to become one of the biggest names in independent Black romance in the 1990s. First-time authors flocked to the company, and some, like Mildred Riley of the historical romance, went to Genesis after Odyssey folded. Genesis specialized in contemporaries, like Panelists star's 1999 novel Fate, about a young professional black woman, Vanessa, who falls for Scott, a white single dad. Set in Star's native New Orleans, where she attended Xavier and Loyola universities, Fate is partly told through Scott's perspective, which again brings up fascinating questions of reader identification. The hopefulness of this novel and many other contemporary romance storylines make Genesis's output a kind of unique archive of how Black women critically negotiated fantasy and reality in their everyday lives in the 1990s. I'll share one other one because maybe you all can sort of help me think through this one. Another important sort of thing we see in the 90s is self-publishing. And this led to an explosion of voices and perspectives, some of whom, really challenge, let's say, our definitions of what constitutes romance.
He doesn't even want to show us.
So, Vietnam veteran and accounting instructor John Ballard brought out 143 Means I Love You in 1999 with CNC Publishing in Tampa, Florida. It's the story of a college professor who moonlights as an agent for the FBI.
Sure.
Romance hero.
That's what we call romance reasons over here.
Romance reasons.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. And whose romance with a former student. I should have stopped at FBI agent. Oh no. I should have stopped at FBI agent. Is encapsulated by the opening scene in which the singer Michael Bolton wishes to...
Yes!
Amazing. This book is perfect.
Michael Bolton actually does greet them and say, "Hey, how are you doing? You all look like a lovely couple." So, look, John Ballard, Professor Ballard, might not have seen his book published were it not for the fact that he hired CNC Publishing to put the book out. So how the book was then distributed is something of a mystery, because I purchased this copy at a bookstore in Atlanta. I think we can imagine Ballard would have done what many indie Black authors did, which is to go on self-funded book tours through retail spaces in their communities and regions. And it's that part of John Ballard's story that I'm fascinated by, right? The fact that the 90s is the great decade of self-published Black authors taking their books, putting them in the trunks of their car, and selling them all over their communities. So these are just 3 titles from my expansive collection that I haven't written about, but I thought this was a perfect occasion to share them with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
that was really fabulous. It's so interesting how people can be like in far distances and then your work sort of intersects, because when I think about Odyssey and what you're talking about, how Leticia she used her retirement money to start this, I'm so mad because I got rid of those books when I was moving. And I knew when I was going to I was like, you shouldn't do it. And I did it anyway. But I'm glad you found that. And then in terms of Genesis Press, I did an episode with Barbara Keaton and Natalie Dunbar, who wrote for Genesis Press, and they were talking about it on there. And it just so happens that I was also interviewing Ceresia Glass, and Ceresia Glass had written for Genesis. And they kind of all knew each other, Well, Ceresia was in her own podcast. But they, a lot of the work intersected. So thank you for sharing that. Oh my God.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. Hearing you present, I was like, Julie has interviewed people.
Yeah, right. We did this.
Been at these publishers who found their way to romance through the routes that are not necessarily documented elsewhere, that you wouldn't know if you looked only at the big 5, right?
Yeah. But one more thing, but what's interesting too is that other people, so you hear the wonderful things, right? But you also hear the complexity too. So for example, when I did an interview with Gwyneth Bolton, who is Gwendolyn Poole, who's a professor, and she was talking about one of her characters, and she was saying that, like there are certain rules about how characters should look. And so she said that they didn't like one of her characters because like she was just too, I don't know, like aggressive or, and so they wanted her to like tone it down. So when in those podcasts, you kind of also hear these sort of strict rules and the boxes that sometimes they were put in, because of the submission rules. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. The politics of respectability, I think, is a big part of that, and how it has, particularly with Black-owned presses that were consciously putting out Black romance, what kind of image is being shared, and not just like on the covers of the books, but within. But another pivot, if I may, to talk about book covers and just books in general, part of what I find so interesting about this is these are print books. If we can maybe just get a scan of hands in the audience, if you're willing. How many of you who are romance readers or, readers read ebooks nowadays? Okay, as your primary source.
Yeah.
Not
Primarily.
Okay, yeah, me too. Right,
me too.
and Jen, you've talked about this, right? Just accessibility, just how that's changed the industry. We can get back to the illustrated covers, but there's so much in terms of the evolution from just the 90s to today. So Sarah and Jen, if you want to share, particularly with your Trailblazer series, how any of those themes have been apparent.
One, it's funny because I think the question is often like, what's your favorite, right? Or like what really stuck with you? And I was thinking a lot there, and I have two like disparate ones that I think kind of relate in ways, I think also to the first panel. And one, of course, is Nora Roberts saying, I wanted her blood in my throat, talking about Janet Daly plagiarizing her, which, if you haven't heard that.
Amazing.
But also I thought a lot about Brenda Jackson, who talked extensively about working full-time at State Farm for most of her writing career. And how one of the things that I think gets very lost in the conversation about romance is like the field is that like this is our work. And that is work that is widely denigrated. Right? And I don't mean to get emotional because I don't actually even write. I'm being ridiculous. But I think a lot about how like the reason like the podcasts are so powerful is to like, and we sit like internally in-house on our text, I guess, say like no one else is going to care about this. So we have to like record these voices because right. And that's the thing, like, this is our work. This is the work of generations of women and authors. And I feel like sometimes that's the thing, like, I really respect about it. Like, this isn't just garbage, this isn't mom porn or whatever. And when we have authors on and they talk about their work, they're so serious about it, and it deserves that gravity, I think.
Sarah, did you want
I would just say that seeing the discussion about Odyssey and Genesis and thinking about the Trailblazers that we've done, and we've been very intentional about who we've chosen to speak to, or who we've asked to speak to immediately, and because we are really racing against time. When we think about romance, modern romance, we can almost touch the first of them, and so we are trying very hard to get as many of those authors on tape. I guess it's not tape, but recorded for the future, because they have not been. We have interviewed so many people who this room would know and love, who have never been asked to sit for an hour and talk about their work and their history, and they are the people who know the history. You talked about the 90s, the early 2000s. Also, there were so many small presses having Radcliffe on. I wish Len was here, having Radcliffe on to talk about where the queer presses were. E.E. Ottoman has been on our podcast, as he believes he is the first trans historical author, at least out trans historical author. Having these people talk about the webs. I mean, I have a literal murder wall in my office of like what got bought by whom. Yep. Where people were published first, what houses closed, shut down, because this is an expensive proposition that you are sinking your retirement money into.
Right.
And we kept saying, like, somebody should be doing this, right? Somebody should be making sure that there is a giant history of all the pathways that this genre all the places this genre has been, and no one was. And I don't know that you would know better than I don't know that this is true. Maybe this is true for every genre. Maybe this is true for, all genre fiction, but it feels personal for us.
Yeah. Julie, on that note, I'm wondering if you might be willing to share a little bit about, you've consciously produced oral histories that are extremely personal and documenting Black voices, initially African-American, diasporic, broadening that. Oral history in Afro-diasporic cultures has a very particular meaning and comes through and from a particular kind of tradition. So if you can share just reflections, if you have them, on the meaning of capturing oral histories for Black writers.
Yeah, I think the histories are so, particularly when I was doing the writing on that African American romance, right, and documenting it, it was so few, right? And a lot of times people are saying things about the writers. I really wanted to hear their own words, and I wanted it documented. And I think in particular, when I was doing the section on Vivian Stevens, right? When that podcast came out, people tweeted, and I think Rebecca Weatherspoon was one of them, and they were like, I didn't think she was alive.
Yeah.
So I think for me, no matter what, that's going to be in the record, right? They've said it in their own words, and people will come back and have that. So I think that's just simply put, I wanted people to hear their voices, not what I said, but how they said it and what they went through. When I interviewed Sandra Kitt first, yeah, she responded to me first, and it's interesting that she responded to me first because she was everybody talks about her like that, like her house was where they all gathered and the writers and they made with the editors, right? So she was first, so it's so funny that she responded first. And then I interviewed Brenda Jackson, and then Brenda Jackson started to talk about, I had suspected that they were experiencing certain things, in terms of being marginalized, racism. But when she actually said that, they wanted to publish her book, they didn't have a problem with the writing of the book. It was just they wanted to change the characters. And so I heard, and I was just, my jaw dropped. I do this stuff every day, but to hear it in her own words, and I was like, wait till people hear this. This is amazing. Yeah. And then it wasn't just Brenda Jackson that said it. It was over and over. Rachel Aller said she had novels in her drawer that because they wanted her to change the character. And she said, some of us did change the characters. I didn't want to do it. And she said, I'm not saying anything about them. I'm just saying I didn't want to do it, right? And over you hear these stories, these experiences. People need to hear that, right? But what's interesting then is I wanted to also, I know people tweet and people tell me they want to hear the one about the early history, the 1990s, 1980s, if I can. They have access to the younger writers. But I wanted the younger generation because I wanted to find out if they also experienced those things. And to a small extent, yes, but their experiences are different because they say the others, the older generation paved for them. So to me, the oral history is important because it's there. It's in the record now. Yeah.
Awesome. And I think that's such a great statement of the way that your podcast has changed what romance history looks like, sounds like, what the kind of public narrative is. And that's something I think is also happening with not just the Trailblazer series, but Fated Mates. I mean, you guys have really, the three of you have documented evolutions, even in the growth of your own podcast. So maybe on that note, we can talk a little bit about Bridgerton. just a little. Carol, what are your thoughts? And how can you help us? Sorry, that's
how can my thoughts about Bridgerton? You know, Bridgerton to me is such an interesting phenomenon, for good and for bad, because to me it's there's no denying how it is this just media juggernaut where people who've never heard of historical romance, never thought of it as being something to be respected, know what Bridgerton is, right? Like, I mean, it's on a sort of like a different level. But what was interesting to me, there's a lot of writing. I sort of like made it my mission to read like everything people wanted to say about and write about the racial dynamics of like the blind casting and how that worked, right? Because, Bridgerton is famously a very white historical, right? Romance. And
as a book,
there's a lot around that, right?
As a series.
Yes, yeah. The series, the book series, excuse me. And then on Netflix, it's not exclusively that at all. And it makes a difference, right? The volume casting makes a difference, but it's not, it's not the same to me. I want to see original stories in which the characters are meaningfully, significantly realistic, like are Black, like that they're telling the stories of Black people from that period. And I don't think Bridgerton really does that. So it's not doing everything I want, but one thing it is doing that I do want to give it credit for, and I think I really give Shonda Rhimes the credit for this. So much, I'm really interested in adaptations of books, but what I see is that I feel like there's this renaissance of romantic comedy, but where we used to have sort of like mid-level budget romantic comedies that would open in theaters, now we're getting sort of like low-budget streaming versions. And what Bridgerton did that was different is that it gave a real budget. I mean, it not only gave budget, the technical, say what you will about other aspects of the story, but the technical prowess that's on display, I think, in that is, to me, just absolute excellence, right? That the costumes are gorgeous. The cinematography is gorgeous. And I haven't seen romance get that sort of treatment in a while. Mm-hmm. I don't know when, and right? Ever. And to me, that, I liked seeing Shonda make it a spectacle. Mm-hmm. And so I found that really gratifying. And I think that's why it was number one for so long and why it continues. And like people are continually like talking about it. I don't know.
So I would say reflecting on Bridgerton's success as a romance reader, I think I want to talk a lot about like one of the things that was said over and over again in the first panel is that like romance is so responsive, right? And so it felt a little weird, like driving in first gear, to have the biggest romance event be based on books that were 20 years old, because 20-year-old books are 20-year-old books in romance, right? Like that actually means something. Mm-hmm. The way that those books think about race and gender and, you name it, is dated. And so as a romance reader, although I did enjoy the spectacle, that I don't know how else to describe that feeling of like everyone else being like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And me being like, well, wait until you see what romance is doing now. Right? And so for me, it's like, it was like the cognitive dissonance of primarily being a reader. Mm-hmm. And I could see that the footprints of Bridgerton were from a previous romance generation. Mm-hmm.
Can I add one thing about that? Because I made a list in my head, And of the books that I think are doing really interesting, like fabulous things, the book I want to see made into something really special. I mean, books exist and are important in and of themselves, but if we're doing adaptations, I want to see an unconditional freedom. That's what, I want to see that story.
That's by Alyssa Cole.
By Alyssa Cole, and everyone should read it.
Yeah.
Sarah, any thoughts? Or I can also add on that note, sorry.
Tell your friends in Netflix about other romance.
If anyone's out there, I'm just putting it out there.
Bridgerton, I cannot express enough how powerful it was for those of us in the community to see something that is in many ways, just in the ether of historical romance on screen and in all the ways Carol described. It's stunning. Everybody's beautiful. It was great to see sex on the screen, in a mostly healthy way. The second season, in a very healthy way. And I think I just want more. I think romance readers read, this is an old study, but RWA used to say a million years ago, romance readers read on average 12 books a month. That means a lot of us are reading. How many people here read about a book a day? Yeah. So we are voracious, and we have one show and also, a handful of movies that I wish were better.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, more. And I just want to eat, I just want to eat it all up. Call your friends.
No, that's so well said, because I think for me, one takeaway is Bridgerton, but not in isolation, right? Especially because 20 years old books written by a white author. There are other books, historical romances, that feature Black people that are written by Black authors. Mm-hmm. And this also comes down to money, right? Mm-hmm. Whose stories are getting elevated and who's getting the money for that elevation. Mm-hmm. And so I see kind of an importance to seeing Bridgerton not in isolation from the podcast that you three run, because you're bringing and telling these stories of other people who have been doing this work. It's not new, like you were saying, Carol, but so many people are like, where is this? How can I find it?
Yeah, this leads me, I don't know anything about Bridgerton, but this leads me to think about why it was that I decided to focus my questions the way I did. Because when I was reading the novels, I'm always curious about what the writers, what's shaping the writers, what are writers thinking about. But then I was also curious about what was the editorial, what were the submission guidelines? Mm-hmm. How did the editors help to shape things? That's why I'm asking those types of questions. So when you're talking about this, I'm saying one more thing before I say that. So I'm thinking about, when I asked Alyssa Cole the same question. All writers get the same questions. And I always ask them about editorial decisions and shaping and all that. And I asked if Alyssa Cole had faced some of the same issues that, Beverly Jenkins or Brenda Jackson or Rochelle Allers faced. And she said no. She didn't really face that. But, if you read an article by Bim Adewumi, she wrote for BuzzFeed, and she featured Alyssa Cole in there. And Alyssa Cole's almost there were 3 Black women that were that helped her with Unconditional. One did the cover. Ese Soga edited her, right? It makes a difference who's acquiring this stuff. Mm-hmm. So back to the whole issue of Bridgerton. My question is who's advising Shonda to acquire?
Interestingly, that article has been optioned for television.
Which one?
That BIM article.
Really?
Wow. The article, none of the books, but the article has been optioned for television.
Yeah. What does that
I
mean?
know, it's so random.
What does that mean?
I know.
What can you repeat it?
Oh, this article that
I've got it. I think
Dr. Moody-Freeman was just referring to.
It's titled it's BIM Adewumi By the 1 May, yeah. Meet the Black Women Upending the Romance Novel Industry, BuzzFeed, which they laid all of them off. First, 1 May 2018. Upending, upending. And you can also, okay, I'll do a plug for the Journal of Popular Romance Studies. We have a special issue, Black Romance, and it's in the bibliography for that, and it's free online.
Journal of Popular Journal of Popular Romance Studies.
Special issue, Black
Oh yes,
Romance.
the May 2022.
With Margot Hendricks.
Yes.
Where's Margot? Margot is, there you are. Co-edited with Margot Hendricks.
Yes.
Elizabeth Grace.
All right. So we're going to open it up for questions in just a few minutes, but we touched on Bridgerton. I neglected to address the first part of the panel title, which is Bodice Rippers. If we could maybe just have a quick word about what that phrase is and means and how it might inform, I don't know, it's about the covers, right? Like, in part?
And the content.
And the, right. Yes. So go for it.
Bodice Rippers largely refer to a wide swath of historical romances published in the 70s, 80s, 90s that you all might know because of a certain cover model with gravity-defying hair, where often the heroine's bodice, the literal bodice of the heroine, is falling off her. It is also gravity-defying in a lot of ways. And then in the books, of course, there was a lot of questionable consent. There are many, many theories on why that is about the books, and that's for another panel. But the content is very much, many of these books have a traditional alpha hero who is forceful, and the way that he treats the heroine in the beginning of the book, or for much of the book, requires force during intimacy. And but we have, that is evolving. We have bookstores that are called the Rip Bodice for a reason, because we are saying what if, in my opinion, there are definitely moments where I have explicitly written a bodice ripper with enthusiastic vocal consent, right? I want to rip this off you. Yes, do it, tear, because heroes are strong enough to tear, steel and bone and silk and all of that. So, in my real life, I'm a middle school teacher, so this is I'm having a good time. And I guess here's what I'll say, like, when we talk about Colleen Hoover and whether or not kids should be reading, it ends with us. When we talk about dark romance and whether or not people should be writing about those things, we're talking about bodice rippers. And I would like to say that, like, we just still live in a society where we will wring our hands endlessly about young women reading about these things and do nothing about the world they will face where they actually have to deal with it.
Actually, I just want to add one thing about that. I find it fascinating, and honestly, this is what sort of drew me to study media, because the media gets so much criticism for the content that they're showing, but what they're showing is, by and large, a reflection of the ideas and the desires and the problems in society. And maybe we should be attacking, why is it that women felt like they needed force to then have access to pleasure, right? Like, that's what we should be concerned with.
Please.
At the risk of wading into something that I'm very much not a specialist in, a final cover I want to show you is of a Black romance novel written by a Black woman, that when I said earlier that studying this stuff and collecting this stuff actually expands your frame of reference about what constitutes a romance, I feel like her take on the romance genre actually, without even using the word bodice ripper, takes up the same questions of consent and violence, but from a perspective that's centered on contemporary issues and reality. And on the 8th Day She Rested, which is a great title, was published by Sidorian in 2001, and it lies at the intersection of contemporary and erotica, which is reflected by Mason's blurbs. So Sidorian doesn't have a physical location, but with a little research, you can find out that it was coming out of Raleigh-Durham, the Raleigh-Durham area. But it was one of these early 2000s entirely online outfits that really collected submissions from first-time authors through the internet and then published their works. But even though you don't see it here, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is that this novel includes a reader's guide, which poses questions like, quote, given the choice, would you have taken Adrian back, right? And if you found yourself in this situation, what would you have done? And this is the kind of thing you find in print books, right? Remember those reader's guides from the 1990s and 2000s that I think really makes them a kind of vibrant and engaging part of readerly communities. But this struck me as an example of dealing with the same questions, even though it's not necessarily a bodice.
I think we're going to open it up to questions
Can
now.
I just say one other thing?
Oh, of
I'm
course.
sorry, and it's not related to any of this. I meant to say, I meant to talk about Vincent Virga, whose collection of papers is in the Beinecke, and I want to say that here. Vincent is possibly, you asked what's our favorite, and I did not answer it because I cannot answer that question. Every one of them is so good. But Vincent is definitely in like the top one. No, Vincent was the author of Gaywick, which is certainly one, we hesitate to say the first ever, but certainly one of the earliest Gothic male-male romances, historical male-male romances. He is, I mean, the conversation with Vincent transformed me as a writer, as a person, as a just being in the world. He wrote Gaywick, or Gaywick's launch party was the same night as the Ramrod nightclub massacre in New York City. His work in terms of putting joy and hope and love on page is so powerful, and he is a voice that is very unsung in the large world of romance, but all of his papers live here. He was a Yale graduate, and I hope you all go and listen to his Trailblazer episode because it is tremendous.
Thank you so much.
I loved it.
I love that. We have a question from the back. Oh, and just please do keep your questions as questions.
Shirley Hale stuff. Podcast.
Yes, she does.
Yes.
See whether or not I can make this a question then. I didn't realize how much history I know and how much history was all of you guys reminding me that I have. But I have a lot of the stuff you asked for looking for either on my website or in my closet. So I have a card for you in the end, but I actually don't have a question.
Okay. Thank you. Right here in front.
Hello, quickly, thank you for the Black Romance podcast and the Fading Maids podcast because it's opened up a door for me to start collecting. So on to my question. How, not necessarily from a library and information science standpoint, could a young collector maybe get their collection out in the public? Meaning, I didn't know all of these books, publishing houses, authors existed, and I've started collecting them, but now I'm like, what do I do with this? Because it's great for me and a feeling to have 400 books sitting on my bookshelves that I get to look at every day. But I'm like, how do I get this information out for people to see the books, see that they existed, read them, find out that some of the authors publishing today, like Farrah Rochon, Ceresia Glass, this isn't their first rodeo, right, and have them get to their backlist that probably isn't in print or more difficult to find.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that one of the best things to do is to value your collection in its own right and submit it as part of these sort of prizes that award young collectors for creating archives out of unusual or essentially new types of books that haven't been collected before. And my colleague Rebecca Romney back there has some experience in
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand, Rebecca.
Experience in
We were
running
looking
such
for you.
prizes. Putting them out on the web is one thing, but making sure you have the ear of journalists, of media creators, of academics who are vested in, getting the word out through things like prizes or library sort of collection newsletters, I think is the best way to value your collection. But in other words, seeking these channels is a great way of doing that, and really documenting your collection. And here's another thing I'll mention: documenting all the titles and checking to see if your resources allow it, if there's more than one edition. Because so much of the drama of popular genres and popular fiction isn't just about a singular edition or copy, it's about how they change over time. So this isn't really even in the remit of rare book selling or sort of antiquarian ways of viewing collections. When you think about different editions of books and how they change over time, and really doing that deep bibliographical work, you can start to make arguments about changing readerships and creating a bigger social history of readers that's going to be important not just to collectors, but to readers, to audiences. And that's where you start building whole new narratives and histories that was the subject of the first panel. So don't just collect and show off your collection, collect multiple copies of different editions of your books, because there is a drama about how things change over time.
Especially in romance.
Especially in romance. I do it through covers, but there's so much else besides. And multiple editions, multiple copies is the best way to do that.
I would just like to say that there is a episode of Fated Mates with Rebecca where she talks about how romance readers can think of themselves as collectors. And I'm going to put words in, I'm going to repeat something she said, and much less eloquently, so go listen to that episode. But the thing that really changed my way of thinking about being a romance reader and a collector is that, her point was you don't have to go back and buy the old books. You can start collecting now with the books you are passionate about now. And the thing that, we talk about on the podcast all the time is the mass market paperback, those little books, they were designed to be thrown out. They were designed to not exist anymore. It is incredibly difficult to find, old books that you loved. So if you have them, keep them, love them, use them. Rebecca says, don't put them in plastic. They're made to live. And so, whatever your collection is, it's yours and it's special because it's yours, and you should think of it that way. And I think that's really powerful. And another sort of way that romance especially can live in this wider world.
Thank you. And shout out to Type Punch Matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
So following the theme, first of all, I don't know how large your archive is. I was curious about that. How large is your archive?
With all the independent Black press books, I'd say maybe 500, 600 books.
So following her question, before I came to this conference, I said, let me just go check in my storage unit to see how many I have. So I found 5 books. I couldn't reach the others past my suitcases. I have the Mildred Riley one you put up there. I have a copy of a book, I don't remember which one, in hardback and in mass market. So, and I started because I was obsessed with getting all of the Black romances that came out early. I'm sure most of my stuff is out of print. But I am anxious now. I'm realizing I have a very valuable collection. This should go somewhere, or we should think about it some other broader perspective. This does not include the collection you would say starting now in my house. I have many, many more of more recent vintage, but to realize, and I didn't even live in Massachusetts when that Mildred Riley, and I'm reading the back of that, and I said, oh my God, so I live close to the Wampanoags now. I didn't even know that story. So I really am, what to say about those of us who are concerned about not only preserving for ourselves, but beyond, and wherever there may be vehicles to accept this and all of that.
I just think you should hand that to Rebecca.
Yeah, Rebecca,
Rebecca's going to answer that question for us.
Rebecca's handing
Rebecca.
it to Rebecca.
Hi,
Yeah.
sorry, rare book dealer. here.
Rebecca,
This
could
is what
you
I do.
stand so people can thank you?
Yeah.
Hello, rare book dealer. And so I did a similar thing where I'd built up a collection of romance novels that then I put together in a catalog and sold as a capsule collection to a university library special collections to be a foundation for the studying and teaching of romance. And I made the catalog for that open access online. You can see it so that it was meant to be exactly like, what are we looking for? What are these things? Odyssey Press is in there, Genesis Press is in there, the Holloway House romances are in there. And it was meant to be something of a model, but also to encourage other people to start having these types of conversations. I want to plug really quickly some of the book collecting prizes if I can, because there's the David Ruggle Prize, which is it's a cash award, I think about $1,000 for a book collection put together by a collector of color, and it's an annual prize. I really encourage you to look into that and consider applying if you have a collection. And then in 2017, I co-founded a prize for women in the United States age 30 and younger for book collecting annual prize, $1,000. And similarly, if you fit in those parameters, please, I would love to hear from you. And specifically, if you have any questions about, I'm a collector or I want to get into collecting, or I'm seeing all of these white dealers handle my material and what is happening, I want to be a dealer myself, how do I get into this? Come talk to me. We'll have those conversations. If you want your collection to end up in an institution, come talk to me. There are ways to do that. And a lot of this has been very small and niche in its own little world, or a book world. And it really shouldn't be specifically with romance, because romance has been shunted out of so much of these conversations. So we need to open up those conversations. So please come talk to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Say, as we give a mic to another person, Rebecca's catalog, Open Access, is linked on our website on the resources page. And Rebecca, if you can email us the prizes that you just mentioned, we'll be sure to get them on that resources page as well. Professor Nishikawa's point, Sarah, Jen, everyone up here. Clearly the wealth really lies in readers' homes, in your grandmother's basement, on my grandmother's bookshelf. So that's the point. Yes, in the back.
And think about how many books you could buy with 1,000 books.
Oh, okay, in the middle and then in the back.
Hi, my name is Savannah Farson, and I am an indie author, and I'm appreciating this conversation about making sure that we capture the history of all of the books that have been written. But what I'm hearing is that a lot of this is centered around presses, whether independent or traditional. I wonder how you are being able to capture the authors who are not in those circles at all, because I think especially nowadays, I think the indie authors are really at the forefront of pushing what it is that romance can be. And I think especially in the Black historical context, that has always been the case. So if you could talk about that and how you're able to add that to the scholarship and to the conversation, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Because I was thinking about how the podcast sort of evolved. It evolved. It started with print, because that's where I started. Waiting at Walden Books and stuff. But as I kept going, some of the people on the podcast, Piper Hughley talked about, she spent 2 years building her website, before she self-published, and then she got traditional. Farah Rashan publishes traditional and and self-published, and she says in fact the self-publish drives people to the traditional.
Mm-hmm.
D.L. White, I interviewed her, I think season 2 or 3, season 3 maybe. She built her own website. She negotiates with voice actors to produce her book in audio. It's like she has her full website. Katrina Jackson, where's Katrina Jackson? Is right here, right? So she's done. Margot Hendricks, who writes as Elizabeth Grace. She's not fooling with Amazon. No, she self-publishes her stuff. Christina P. Jones, I interviewed. Beautiful website. Listen, you can click and you can go by tropes, or you could go by, it's amazing. So I talked to her about that. So to me, these self-published and independents they're amazing. They're beautifully written. So I really appreciate that question because that's how I dealt with it. When I did the podcast, I started with people who were doing traditional, but it evolved and we're seeing really amazing work coming out.
As a journalist, I would also say, if you're covering romance and you're not covering independent, you're not covering romance. You're not covering contemporary romance, at least, right? So when I was writing, I was covering books for the Griot for a bit, and one of the first things I had to pitch multiple times is okay, we have to do a list that's really focused on Black indie romance, right? So we did that. And then I know whenever I am asked to do lists, I try to make sure that it's really representative of what's going on. And when I contributed to Black Loves Matter anthology, I think 2 of the 3 books that I talked about were indie. It's Alexandra House and Christina P. Jones. And when Julie asked me to, she's doing co-hosted episodes where she gets someone else to do the interview with her. And the first people that I thought of were well, I want to do indie, and if it's not indie, then I want to do international. Yeah. And somebody else had already taken all my indie people. So
Christina.
Yeah. So then I did oh my God, Bolo Babalola, who's a British Nigerian author. But yeah, I think indie is absolutely shaping where romance is going when you talk about the evolution, queer romance, romance about people of color, also romance about people who have different, that are facing different challenges in other ways. I think independent romance is at the forefront. Talking about aromantic and love stories. One of the first that I read was Talia Hibbert. Before she was traditional, she was doing indie, and that's what she was writing about. So one of her things she was writing about. So yeah, I think that if you're interested in contemporary romance, especially, you have to be reading it.
I think in terms of our podcast, our base assumption is that readers don't know or care who published the book, and maybe only know if you put it in front of them, probably would guess by price. Right at this point, that's how they're knowing. So we have pretty extensive show notes on the page, including these photo arrays, and I am the one who does those, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how this is going to be a very bizarre archive of a very specific snapshot of romance time. And that's probably a good thing. And, I think I spent a lot of time thinking about archiving it. It is actually being archived. The Fated Maid site is being archived, I think, at the University of Michigan.
No, Bowling Green.
Bowling Green State Universities.
Yes, because
Steve Amadon.
Okay. But anyway, whatever. It doesn't matter. Someone's archiving it, bless.
Maybe
and
Michigan too.
And
that's a different email.
Yeah,
I didn't get that one.
I was but I think the thing that's interesting to me about that then is knowing that that's going to sort of live on. But I'm also one of the things I've been trying to do now is going every time I put up a new page, I try to go back to an old page and take all of the articles that we referenced and turn them into PDFs. And now I'm putting them in Google Docs. Maybe that's going to die like Sears one day. Who knows? And so this question of how, because I think a lot about if you go back to our first episodes and click on links, some of those links are dead now. Right? Yes. I know that. And so it's really something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but I'm also the one-woman archive show of our romance podcast. I don't know.
No, you are right. We were working with the archivists at DePaul, and we're trying to transfer we're 30 years for the Center for Black Diaspora, and we're trying to make sure everything gets there. And we were well, let's make sure that it lives online, because that's going. And they were no, that does not necessarily last forever. Mm-hmm. Those hard copies, those ones are more likely to last. So you're right to put those.
So I think my point, I really want to answer Savannah's question. We talk a lot about indie authors, but we never really talk about them as separate. Everything, we just talk about them as whatever it is we're talking about. So I don't think but maybe that means it's a weakness that we've also never highlighted it specifically too. So that's something we can think
There are still a couple barriers, though. Two I want to mention are one, independently published books aren't as likely to be in your library, and being voracious readers, unless you have like unlimited finances, you know, a lot of my reading is borrowing things, ebooks from the library. And so if, you know, if my favorite indie authors aren't in the libraries, that makes a difference. I think that's changing a little bit, and you can request, I mean, one thing you can definitely do to support people is request their books through your library. And I think that built up of demand, I think things are shifting a little bit in terms of the distributor that distributes ebooks. And then the other thing is in terms of getting coverage, I mean, in like solo title reviews aren't as prevalent in mainstream media for romance, but I've tried, I always try to make sure that like for the one publication that I have written for consistently for like 5 years, I really try to push them to include indie. The only thing is that they are print monthly and their deadlines are like, you know, you can't, it's really hard to get a review. I write to people and I'm like, can I get a review copy, you know, 2 months in advance? That's not the way indie publishing works. Whereas traditional publishing, you can get a review copy 3-4 months in advance of publication. So that's one barrier I find in covering it a little bit, but I try to work around that. Roundups you can do after day of publication. So that's.
I mean, I think the other thing, and you know, all my Kindle readers, sometimes these books disappear. Right? Like you know, so you're like, God, remember that. I mean, I think a lot about remember that book. And then you do that thing where you're like, okay, remember the book where, and then someone remembers it and we can find that book. But like, we are going to be approaching the era where remember that book is going to be a book that was briefly in print on Amazon only as a digital book only. And now it's gone. And how are we going to find that book again? So download your favorites. Don't rely on Kindle Unlimited. Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a few more. Thank you. That's brilliant. We're going to take a few more questions in the back.
Hi, I'm going to have a question and then like a slight little plug. The two of us are from Schlesinger Library at Harvard. So, and we're both in the published materials department, catalogers, and we're currently doing a project where we're cataloging I'm cataloging specifically hundreds and hundreds of romance novels right now. And this has been amazing. So I'm going to put a little plug in that we do buy a lot of them, but we had one very large collection that came in over a couple years. And it's like, you know, 1,500, 1,600 books. But as I'm going through them, they're not very representative of people who are not, they're basically all middle-aged white women writing them, and that's who the characters is. And we are trying to buy more. We definitely bought many of your books and stuff. But if people have collections of them, there are libraries like us, which is a women's history library, that would love to talk to you about acquiring these amazing collections. So basically, we have them as a site for research, not necessarily just pleasure, but these are things that are going to be archived. They're not going to be deaccessioned. They're going to be here. So my question will come in is, you know, us having these not as a site of pleasurable reading or things necessarily for people for a site of research. How do you see like being able to like promote that to people? Like we have, you know, like romance as a site of research that people can do and not necessarily, I don't know how to like frame it, but just like.
I think I hear what you're saying, and I like the academics are going to talk about getting academics there. I would like to encourage you to invite your local romance book clubs to show up. Because I feel like, listen, nobody.
Especially in Boston, holy crap. You have a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, I
feel like there's always like a romance. I mean, I don't know. We're so used to feeling like, I don't know, the idea that like academics study romance is kind of amazing, right? And so if you want to talk to real people, I feel like it's like finding the readers. And, you know, so, you know, contact us. We can talk about it on the podcast or whatever. But I do feel like are you kidding me? You want to let me look at your books? Okay. Sounds good. I'll be there.
Plus, we'll read them in like an hour or two.
Yeah.
You know, it's fine.
Right?
Any thoughts, professors on this end?
I forgot. Yeah. How do you get people to use the archives? Yeah. How do you get people to use the archives?
Yeah, let them know that they're there. Yeah. Well, isn't this a little bit, I'm not an academic, but isn't this a little bit about encouraging other academics to do academic research and publish on romance?
It is. And I do want to name, just real quick, the archive that was mentioned earlier at Bowling Green. It's the Ray and Pat Brown Popular Culture Library. It is incredible. Incredible. Thousands and thousands of books, central archive for popular romance studies, and a lot of other subjects within pop culture.
Yeah, and I think for me, my very quick way of saying this is to echo the first panel to say it's incumbent on us to teach this stuff. Special collections ought to be teaching libraries where these books don't just collect us, but we have to bring them into the classroom and teach them as we would any kind of archival material, and really draw connections for students that show them the value of these books in history, but also in the present day. That means not just researching them to put into dissertations and footnotes, but curating exhibitions and public programming that really reach out to the community in the exact same way that this conference is doing. So teaching, public outreach, that's got to be how humanities-based work sort of moves forward in the 21st century.
Other questions?
Question in the back.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to start by saying thanking the panelists and the organizers for putting this together. This really brought me back to like the late 90s when I was in high school and picked up my first romance novel, traveling in the airport, and fell in love with it, and is a welcome break for someone who is dissertating. So thank you.
Thanks, Kenya.
A lot of this conversation today, I feel, has been about representation in these romance novels. And one group of people who are often left out of romance in general are people with disabilities. So I'm wondering what shifts you all are seeing within the genre when it comes to people with disabilities and disability representation in romance.
There is more. There is not enough, is my answer. The world of romance is growing exponentially. Last night, Bea and Leah from the Bodice were here, and they talked about how the people who are buying the books are getting younger, which means experience and the way that we live in the world and the way that we talk about the world and the people around us and identity in the world now is being more and more and more represented in the books, in romance novels. That said, there is never enough. But there are really there's wonderful disability rep, there's wonderful rep around ADHD, around neurodivergence, around, there are multiple books this past year about, characters with IBS. I mean, it's just happening everywhere. It feels like we're on the precipice of just a flood of books about people with disabilities. But there can be more. There can always be more. And you're right, we need to do better about talking about those books publicly.
One person that I think does a really good job who's writing about physical disabilities and also neurodivergence is Chloe Leese. And then Alyssa Cole has written, has a couple neurodivergent heroines, one in her Ravenswood series, and then also in Duke, what? Duke by Default. Thank you, a Duke by Default. I'm like, Duke is in there somewhere. What?
Yeah.
Portia. And then also there's she's a character, the one I love is the one character who's in a wheelchair, and I think it's Can't Escape Love. There are other people, but I'm spacing right now.
And I think this is again where
Evie Mitchell,
Talia Hibbert.
I mean, but this is also, I want to say, this is where indie romance is probably doing the work, right? And that it's then going to get picked up by trade, and it's starting there. And so, often it's too finding a reader that you like, that cares about these issues, that can highlight best books. There's a someone on, Twitter is kind of over, but there was someone who kept for a while a romance and disability blog. I'll try and find it and send it to you. I don't know how updated it is. So, I mean, but again, like plenty of indie romance authors are doing the work, and sometimes they just don't get highlighted because the people don't know about them. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, there's a mic right there.
Thank you. Hello. So my question is regarding how do you remain focused and on task when you are collecting, you're doing research for the podcast discussion, character building, world building, and your writing, because as you're doing all of this, you come across so much stuff that's interesting, and you can take so many 3-hour, 2-week side quests. But how do you do it? What is your process, your method, your organization? And the person about disability and romance, it's not a book, but it's called Special, a Netflix series about a man with MS who's exploring his sexuality as a gay male. And I am not of the LGBTQ community, but anyone who watches it, you will be rooting for him because it is so well developed and it's so great. So it's called Special on Netflix.
And before we answer that question, I think someone else had a mic, so let's just take these last 2 questions.
Okay.
It's actually not a question. It's really quickly. I work at BGSU. I used to work, and so I want to plug my former colleague, Steve Amiddown, who was a head archivist at BGSU's Pop Culture Library.
Yes.
He blogs now at The Romance Historian, and I would highly recommend if you're interested talking to him, because one of the things that Steve did is to go around and find people who were interested in romance and pop culture. And so then he built that archive, and they built that archive into their classes. So their students went there regularly, and they used those archives. And he also did that off campus as well.
Thank you. All right, so last question on process.
You're the author. I think that's for you, sir. I don't keep organized. That's the problem. Listen, we are very, very lucky. We are one of the few podcasts in the world, I think, that has a producer who keeps us on track. I mean, we have a deadline. We have to put out a podcast every Wednesday. And then also, I am very lucky that my friend Jen has a vast knowledge of romance. We don't really prepare as much as we should, everybody. Like, we're just rolling with it. I'm sorry.
We spend a lot of time going, what if we did divorce? And then we're like, okay,
Meet me back here in 33 minutes.
Yeah, let's record in 45 minutes. And it's, because we've been reading since we were 10, right? And it's literally everything in my brain is just romance novels, lists of them. And then as far as keeping organized with work, I would much, much rather, meaning my writing, I would much, much rather be recording a podcast about romance novels than writing one. So then sometimes we get to the, the period of time where I'm on deadline because I don't write every day. Don't tell anybody that. That I get to the end, I get to the deadline, and then we go, okay, here are 6 interstitial topics that we can knock out in 30 minutes because we love these topics. Yeah. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer, because I know that is chaos, but I'm sorry.
Well, thank you so much to our incredible panelists for this.